Conversation.
I can't believe I've seen every episode of Bluey, and Hyle still hasn't watched Shrek. He's really taken a wrong turn in life. If only someone would force him to reincarnate into a baby.
Hello, and welcome to the Kongversation. I'm Hyle Russell.
And I'm Mitchell Wolfe.
Mitchell, hello.
Hello. How are you doing?
This and that. It's a mixed bag, as life is. I can't say that I'm 100%, nor can I say I'm doing terribly.
Well, so the last time I was on this show, Hyle.
Yeah.
We talked about your work ethic and how
Sure.
strong it is, and how I recommended, hey, maybe you should take it easier on yourself.
Yeah.
And this is your 8th podcast this month.
It is, but I took 2 months off before that. Doesn't that count for anything?
It literally does not. That's what you were supposed to do.
Oh.
And, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we've come to the end of March, Mitchell, and we've come to the end of my exhaustive 2 conversation a week self-flagellation. It is Easter weekend, so, it's timely to self-flagellate. Now, 2 episodes a week, to the layperson out there, it might not sound like a lot, especially since we just sit here and we talk about nonsense for 2 to 4 hours on any given podcast. I mean, how much work goes into that? But I know you can relate to this, Mitchell, because you are a podcast meister in and of it yourself. And the Kongversation is not one of these podcasts that are out there where all the hosts do is they sit down and they record it. They have some banter and then they go about their day. They make themselves a nice sandwich after. They might get a massage, have a little spa treatment. No, what the Kongversation is, it's basically all in my hands, aside from my co-host. So what I do is the prep work, the note-taking, the promotion, the post-production editing, which in my case hit several snags toward the end of the month. We had a couple episodes with numerous audio problems requiring me to log significant overtime in order to fix it, to salvage it. And one episode in particular took me 48 hours, pretty much non-stop, minimal sleep, minimal eating, as I try to make it workable in post-production. So I am completely fried right now. And I have to say the only thing keeping me going is, one, I get to talk with my good friend, Mitchell Wolfe, which is a treat. It's a treat unto itself. But also, this is the last one I have to do.
Good.
Yeah. I am caught up now, and we are going to return to our standard 1 episode a week schedule, barring the errant bonus mini episode or special occasions, from here on out for the rest of the season. So if you have been enjoying the bi-weekly conversations, the 2 a week, I apologize that this isn't the permanent state of being, but unless I did get a producer in here to, and people to handle the editing for me, which I don't really feel comfortable with anyway, even if I was making enough money off of this to actually be able to afford that, at what point does that then not be my show anymore? And it's just other people formatting it for me. I don't want to do that. So 1 episode a week, that's workable. That's manageable. That's what we're going to go with.
I would hand off the editing on Telling the Tale to anyone instantly. If they came to me and they said, well, my experiences are that I am 14 years old.
Yeah.
And I've listened to a podcast, and I think I might know what Telltale Games is, maybe. I would say, well, that's more experience than I think anyone is required to have. So go ahead and edit my podcast.
Well, Mitchell, you might be wondering why I plucked you from the ether to co-host this episode with me. Why I have enlisted your talents specifically for this
Nope.
episode? Oh.
No, I know this one. This one I know. Yeah, I actually know this one.
Okay.
Because you told me. Yeah,
Well-
but I see what you're doing, try to involve the audience at home. Maybe they don't know. So I'll pretend. Why'd you bring me on, Hyle?
Yeah, it's not really a good thing if we exclude the audience from the journey.
True.
The journey that we're taking, and I don't want them to feel like everything that happens with this podcast just happens behind the scenes before we do it, and it's not something that they are a part of, holding our hands together, skipping down the merry fields. So that's why I phrased it like that, but you just ruined the immersion. You just ruined the magic, which is completely counter to what we're talking about today, Mitchell. When I announced the Kongversation was returning for season 12 and that I was embarking on my just killer schedule for it, I had most of the episode topics already lined up, already ready to go. Co-host picked out. I was like, yeah, we're going to do that this week. We're going to do that later this week. We're going to do that the week after. All but 1 or 2 episodes toward the end. And one of our regular listeners and longtime patrons, just a full-on DK Vine supporter, a real mensch, if you will, just Andre, someone I know you know quite well, Mitchell, because it was Andre who forced us to do a character witness episode on Mr. Patch way back.
Oh, right,
when.
that was Andre, yeah.
It was Andre, yeah.
Yeah.
So Andre requested, not requested like I want my MTV sort of way, but like just put forth, hey, this would be a lovely episode if you ever think of doing it. They wanted to hear a conversation, and they specifically asked for you to co-host an episode about Gregg Mayles. Rare's Gregg Mayles, because I've often spoken of my admiration for the game design of Gregg Mayles, and I've likened him to a Western Miyamoto. That's been my go-to phrase, my shorthand to describe to the normies out there why Gregg Mayles is a big deal in our circles. But I've apparently never articulated this in depth enough for Andre's satisfaction. And Andre suggested I bring in someone who actually has experience in the world of making video games to hold my hand, to help me get the words out of my mush mouth about why Gregg Mayles' game design clicks with me and so many of our listeners to the extent that it does. And that's where you come in, Mitchell, because you are a gamesman.
I'm a gamesman. I am a gamesman. Thank you. Thank you for recommending me for the episode, Andre, and thank you for having me, Hyle.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the conversations I'm on are weird, like meta commentary shit takes a little bit.
Yeah.
They often do return at some point to being like, oh, this is actually about the thing. Like the Blockbuster episode, which I think is actually still my favorite episode we've done. I like that one. But yeah, I was thrilled and excited to be invited back on the show for something that I think is like authoritatively not a shit take episode. This is actually very much about the stuff. And, it's an aspect of the stuff that we care about on DK Vine that I, am personally very emotionally invested in. So I'm glad to be here to talk about it.
And this I'm going to put it out there. It will. I just don't know with what regularity or frequency. It will become a new episode type for the conversation where we can look at specific creators throughout Rare or the just broader DKU as we define it. And really give them the spotlight, because we give spotlights to characters, to locations, to specific games, but very rarely do we actually spend the time to laud the people behind the magic. And there's reasons for that, which we will get into on this episode. It's mostly how I'm wired. and it's not that I don't like putting on a pedestal the people behind the games that we love so much, but it is hard for me to think in those terms. And that is exactly why Gregg Mayles is the perfect game developer / designer to start this sub-series with, because I think more than anyone I've ever encountered in the industry, Gregg Mayles understands how to make games for freaks like me.
Yeah. For better or for worse, spoiler alert, I think it's for worse. The video games industry has, for a very, very long time, obfuscated the names of people involved with some of the most important video games. And even if the names are out there in the credits, like what they did specifically isn't immediately obvious. Even Gregg Mayles, which I think is an exception to that, because like people in the director's roles usually do actually get their names out there. But even for like Gregg Mayles, if you beat Banjo-Kazooie and you start watching the credits and it says Gregg Mayles, like what's it say? It does not say game director or lead designer like or whatever.
Chief of ideas.
His actual chief of ideas. Yeah, like that was not what he was called at Rare for sure. That's definitely not what his actual title was. Yeah, and then like other people are like keyboard tappers.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's writing or programming or whatever else you might use a keyboard for. Maybe it's a music. Who's to say? But at least their names are out there, and I think the industry is getting better about this slowly. For instance, I put out a game last year and I was able to talk about like some specific things I did on it. That like not everything that I did, but some of the smaller things or some of like the more like, oh, this is fun, we can talk about this. Like that stuff has gotten out there. So there are some things that I think we'll talk about today to kind of put a proviso out there before we get there that might not actually be Gregg Mayles.
Right.
And might be someone else on the team who keeps bringing these ideas back from game to game.
Yes.
And we might never actually learn that. Like that information could be lost to time. Even though most of these people are still alive, there's no way to completely guarantee that we know who we're talking about. We assume a lot of the direction and design choices in these games are Gregg Mayles because he was the lead director and designer. But maybe we don't know. Maybe we're actually praising some other guy whose name we don't even know. It's a weird industry for that kind of thing.
It is.
We just know all the time, right?
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I think there are a few names that always get elevated, even in the video game industry, as like, oh, these are the auteurs. Miyamoto's one, Kojima is another. Like people who are lauded and almost get cults of personality around them. And oftentimes, I mean, not oftentimes, all of the times, video games are very collaborative and there is a lot of back and forth, give and take. Some concessions are made, but I'm not saying with this episode that Gregg Mayles is solely responsible for all of the brilliant bits you remember from games like Donkey Kong Country and Banjo-Kazooie and what have you. That is absolutely not the case. But there are through lines we can follow for what makes a Gregg Mayles designed game different from even other games at Rare, which we will get into on this episode. I'm very excited for it. It's a great idea, Andre. I am listening to what our audience has to say, and occasionally I'll just be like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
They occasionally have a good idea. Yeah.
Well, they have a lot of good ideas, but there's never a chance to really just do everything everybody wants all of the time. But I thought this one would be a really nice way to cap off our first month back for this season, and it'd be a real good way to get Mitchell involved with the show in a way that isn't just a complete piss take. So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we get into it, I want to plug our merchandise store. April means we will have new t-shirts coming to DK Vine on TeePublic, and you can dress fresh for the season ahead, whether it be spring in the Northern Hemisphere or autumn down under. You can find it at dkvine.com/merchandise. Now
Can I design a shirt?
Mitchell, if you want to design a shirt for the merchandise store, please, you have my number. You have all of my numbers. You know how to get in touch with me via text, via DM. You can call me. You can do whatever you want, Mitchell, and I will be receptive.
Here's the shirt. I want to do it right now. Let's mindstorm this shirt. Okay, I think it's a rainbow tie-dye shirt.
Okay.
That's the first one. That's the base. And on the front of it, it says, I enjoy Donkey Kong video games.
Okay, we might not be able to use the word Donkey Kong on it, but
video games.
I enjoy DK video games. That's your shirt.
Yep. Yeah, that's the shirt. And on the back of it, it says, I really, really do. As if to bolster the point made on the front of the shirt.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Look forward to that t-shirt coming to dkvine.com/merchandise.
Cool. And glad we could work together.
Yeah. Good job, Mitch. I see why you're in such high demand in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now that I'm down to one episode a week now, I will have more time to devote to video editing. I'm just going to be chained to my chair, editing one thing or another. But yeah, we have our YouTube channel, dkvine.com/YouTube. And yeah, one of the great things about doing DK Vine full time is I actually have more free time to make videos on the DKU. And it's been really creatively rewarding. It's stretching muscles I haven't been able to stretch and flex for quite some time. So that's what I'm looking forward to in April, is actually getting back to video editing and not just spending all my time trying to salvage podcast. So be sure you subscribe on our YouTube channel, because good things are coming. Fun things are coming your way, to your eyeballs, to your ear holes. Doesn't matter. It's going to be on our YouTube channel. Check it out. And Mitchell, we already talked a little bit about this, but you have a podcast that is the Kongversation.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
I forgot for a second when you said that. I was like, oh shit, am I late? Nope. I do. I have it. Yeah. It's called Telling the Tale.
Telling the Tale.
We do it with Dustin.
Yeah, everybody knows
with
Dustin.
Cool guy Dustin.
Yeah, Dustin Jackson. Yeah.
Yeah, Dustin is actually right now, as we speak, deep in virtual reality to play a VR game called Sam & Max. This time it's virtual, which is sort of a spiritual successor to the Telltale Sam & Max games, except this one's a VR game. And Adam, his roommate, has continued to send me images of Dustin playing the VR game, and he's just like cleared out the whole room, and he's got this giant ski mask on and holding some glowy lights in his hand. It looks like a very, very grounded and sort of disappointing Blade Runner. And he's just deep in that VR. It's great stuff. I didn't have to play this one because I couldn't, so Dustin's gonna just tell me about it.
How can Dustin? Does Dustin have a VR headset?
The Idaho crew has the PSVR set up with their PlayStation.
I had no idea.
Play some PlayStation VR games.
I had no idea the Idaho crew was this far advanced.
Yeah, I think it's PSVR 1, and they bought it after 2 came out. So,
okay.
You know, that's still Idaho Crew style, but but yeah, I think it's a new thing for them.
Okay, yeah, they went to Goodwill to get the hand-me-down VR headset.
I think PSVR 1 might be a little more valuable than PSVR 2 right now because they did not. I don't know if you know about this, Hyle. They did not bring the back catalog for 1 to be backward compatible for 2. So they started over the library, and I don't think people are happy with that because there was a good library of games that were for the PSVR 1 that now you can't play with the 2. So people have still just got the 1.
I've got a Virtual Boy.
Yeah, it's like the same.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you know, it says virtual. Yeah. It must be the same, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One word is good.
Hello to the live stream, by the way. We do live stream the Kongversation episodes that we record for $5 and up patrons. We have just Andre in the live stream. Hello. Andre says,
hello.
I forgot to account for the time zone difference. I just dialed the hotline to share my thoughts, thinking I had another hour left, and saw the notification that you were live. Andre, call in. Call in, because we're going to be chatting for a bit before I get to the calls. I will quickly get your call in there. Feel free. Hello to the Snake Fighter 64. The Snake Fighter 64, she also called in. However, she mostly talked about Steve Mayles, it looks like. So, Snake Fighter, I will not be using your call for this one. However, when we eventually get around to Steve Mayles, which is Gregg's brother, famed artist at Rare and now Playtonic, who has worked on many of the games that Gregg has worked on, Steve deserves a spotlight unto himself. And so we will give equal time to the Mayles brothers eventually. But yeah, we're going to be talking about Gregg on this one. So, we will, probably not be taking that call. Cause I hate for people to confuse them, you know? They're different individuals. Just because they're from the same family, it doesn't mean they're the same.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
I have a dog.
Yeah.
Not the same.
Your dog. Yeah, your dog is not the same person as you, Mitchell.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. That dude eats shit sometimes.
Yeah, they tend to do that. My dog.
I don't even like it that much.
My dog, she loves cat poo, and she seeks it out when she's out for a walk. She's like, let me find that tasty morsel hiding under the leaves. And I'm just like, I didn't raise you to do this. Where's this coming from?
Yeah, it's that rebellious nature that teenagers have.
Yeah. Also, hello to Martros in the live stream. We will be checking in with the live stream as we go along, but for now, we must return to the topic at hand.
Gregg Mayles.
Gregg Mayles. Gregory Malesery.
Is it short for Gregory? I've actually not known that.
I believe it is, but the only notion I have, because for the longest time, I just knew him as G Mayles, because to your point, Rare in the 90s would often abbreviate the names of the creators in the credits. And purportedly, this was done so the stampers would not have their talent poached by other studios.
Yeah, it's a pretty widespread practice, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's a shame. So I didn't even know his name was Gregg. And I didn't even make the connection between the fact that they named the Grim Reaper character in Conquer after him until sometime later. But I think it's Gregory because in the lyrics to the song Grog Mayles, written by Robin Beanland for the game Sea of Thieves, he actually uses the name Groggery Mayles. Mm-hmm. So unless that is just another in-joke and Gregg is not a Gregory, it doesn't really matter.
I really feel like it's a coin flip. It could go either way.
It could go
Whether
either
or
way.
Not, that's yeah. But clearly he prefers Gregg, so I guess we'll use that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gregg Mayles. Yeah, he's been with Rare since the early 1990s and had a hand, or at least a little finger, in all manner of projects. Some he was lead designer on, others he just contributed a little bit, some insight. He's credited with being lead designer first on 2 games from 1994, Battletoads Arcade and Donkey Kong Country. Now, Donkey Kong Country is where Gregg Mayles could, I think, like more than Battletoads Arcade, he could really build his game design ideology from the ground up, because Donkey Kong Country was a blank slate. It was a canvas onto which he could paint his ideas, because there weren't any pre-existing Donkey Kong Country games, Mitchell. There was Donkey Kong for the arcade, but Donkey Kong Country was really where Gregg got to say, this is the kind of game I would like to make.
Well, really, with both games, they're so different from their inspirations. And that's especially impressive, I think, with Battletoads, because the Battletoads arcade game is, it pulls on some of the beat 'em up stuff that was in the NES Battletoads game, much in the same way that Donkey Kong Country pulls on some of the platforming that was in the arcade Donkey Kong games.
Yeah.
But it feels so different, and it's so built up in a very different way. So he's like, even this early, he's establishing a tendency that we'll see a lot later of, even if he goes back to something he's done before or has been done by someone else before, he's not very likely to do it the same way.
Right.
He'll change up some aspect of it, or else he'll just go and work on something different and leave it to another team at Rare.
Yes. Yeah, it is one of the core tenets of Gregg Mayles, which I don't think enough people understand or appreciate, which will be something we're going to come back to. But yeah, with Donkey Kong Country, he kind of set a template that would carry through on all subsequent Donkey Kong Country and Land games. Even Returns and Tropical Freeze use a lot of the Gregg Mayles formula, like long after Gregg Mayles has departed the series. And that's the thing about Gregg Mayles. He's been with Rare for so long, and his vision for Donkey Kong Country was so influential that many of his ideas became this unconscious shared philosophy, not just across that series, but I would say across a lot of Rare's teams in general. And I feel like this helped make this uniformity. And that's what made Rare feel like such a unified magic maker in the 1990s. Because you saw that logo and you kind of knew what to expect. Even if the experiences were going to be wildly different, there was this baseline to it all. And I think a lot of it might have come from Gregg. And I want to stress again that while we're crediting Gregg with a lot of stuff, even among the teams he was a part of, he was just one cog in a well-oiled machine. And so I don't want to say, hey, everything good about Rare was Gregg Mayles, because that is not the case. Just more than design, his design was harmonious with the talented artists, musicians, coders. Like, we will be giving Gregg his due, but I don't want people to walk away with the impression that he is a sole auteur at work. It is always a team effort. So,
yeah. I think the comparison that you made earlier to Miyamoto is a pretty, it's an interesting one. Because on the one hand, I think that saying something like the Western Miyamoto is like, I get it, because like I've sort of come with you on the journey that we've gone in playing all these games and developing a passion for the works of Rare, and specifically the Gregg Mayles team within Rare. But also, like, that's a huge comparison, right? Shigeru Miyamoto is a name that's like nearly household. It's not quite, because I don't think any average household is just like in knowledge of game developers.
Right.
But within like a certain, if you're at least like 40 to 45% nerdy, you do know the name Shigeru Miyamoto. And having Mario and Zelda, like tons of other stuff too, but like just those two under your belt, I think make you the most influential. I've made the argument before. I don't know if you would agree with this, because I think the other person I'll just say it. I've made the argument before that Shigeru Miyamoto is the most influential artist alive, in any medium. And number 2 would be Paul McCartney.
Well, so long as Paul McCartney's in the top 5, I'll allow it.
Yeah, I think that within Western music, and especially pop music and rock music and folk music, the influence of the Beatles is pretty omnipresent.
But even the Beatles were inspired by Motown and 50s rock and like, yeah.
Yeah, like there's other branches of 50s rock that have pervaded into the present that I maybe like aren't as influenced by the Beatles, but maybe are by like Zeppelin or Rolling Stones or Beach Boys or something. I think, well, if you're influenced by Beach Boys, you are in turn influenced by the Beatles because of how much Pet Sounds is based on Rubber Soul. But that's neither here nor there. I'm a bit of a tangent. The point is, like, as much as I think that is true of like the Beatles influence, even if it's not a direct influence, even if it's like a quiet influence or a subconscious influence.
Yeah.
It maybe is specific to a few genres and definitely like the Western world. And in the case of Shigeru Miyamoto, I think it's every video game. Like really every video game takes something from Mario or Zelda. Like even if it's just the 1980s work of that guy, it's pretty inspired at one point or another by a Miyamoto game, which is why it's loaded. It's loaded to say that Gregg Mayles is the Western Miyamoto. I'm bringing. I like to bring little arguments to these shows, Hyle. I like to bring little points. I've got one, and mine is that Gregg Mayles is the Western Yuji Horii. That's my new one. That's the new one I'm bringing.
All right, explain.
Yuji Horii is the designer behind Dragon Quest.
Oh, okay.
Dragon Quest, been on some people's minds lately, I think, because of the passing of Akira Toriyama, who is the Steve Mayles role in all of the Dragon Quest games, and also the creator of Dragon Ball and all that stuff. Really inspired artist, but I think as important as Toriyama to the success of Dragon Quest is Yuji Horii, who is from the ground up, like always been the designer, the lead director of design on every Dragon Quest game. What that series has meant for RPGs and for Japan is kind of from him specifically. And I think that what Miyamoto has done, I think, the Rare fandom's gone back and forth on Miyamoto over the years, right? He's a divisive figure, but I think it can't really be overstated how influential he is and how mainstream and widespread and just ubiquitous his design is. Someone like Yuji Horii, where like we're setting the standard for what this group of people really, really like out of video games. And if you don't like your Japanese role-playing games, maybe you just don't play them. That's fine. That's their own little section. I think of Gregg Mayles as being that kind of thing in an extremely powerful, understated way, in a different part of the world for the United States and England. And, I would put him. I would personally put him in that like highest echelon of game designers. I wrote down a list, Hyle.
Oh,
I wrote down a list of 10, in my opinion, the 10 best designers to ever do it.
Mitchell, you're like Kris Kringle here. You're just
Got little gifts.
jotting down names, yeah.
Yeah. Just like the highest echelon. Here's what I would put. Gregg Mayles. This is no particular order.
Okay.
Gregg Mayles, Shigeru Miyamoto, Yuji Horii. Toru Iwatani, who you might know as the creator of Pac-Man. Hideo Kojima from Metal Gear Solid. John Romero from Doom. Kim Swift from Portal. Jonathan Blow from Braid and The Witness. Matty Thorson, most known for Celeste. And Alex Beecham, known for Outer Wilds recently. I think that those 10 designers are the most immaculate at their job that out of anyone who's ever done it. And I really would strongly feel that Gregg Mayles is very much on that top 10 list somewhere.
And this is why you're here, Mitchell, because you can bring forth such lists where, for me, just personally speaking, I'm so stunted in my video game education because when I was 10 years old, I found the work of Gregg Mayles and I parked myself there. I was basically like, well, this is where I belong. I'm not going to seek out anything else. And while that has led me to have a happy life, I can only really go for the big swings like Gregg Mayles is the Western Shigeru Miyamoto. And I say that partially because of the impact I know it will have in people's brains.
It's a little clickbaity. It's a little clickbaity in a good way. In a nice way.
It is. You know, it's basically my audio mouth diarrhea version of BuzzFeed. But I do know it's effective because, as you said, Miyamoto is as closest as you can come to a household name when it comes to being a game designer. So that's why I do it, you know, but yeah, it's quite interesting to see you break it down like that and give reasons too. That's impressive. You showed your work.
Thank you, Hyle. I appreciate the appreciation. Yeah, with Miyamoto is a, like talking about the most influential video game designers and directors. Miyamoto's a bit of a monolith, casting a shadow over the whole conversation, and deserves fairly to be acknowledged. But I do think can be a bit of a bit of a distraction from what we're really talking about sometimes.
I think that with Miyamoto, like, he's obviously responsible. Like, he started the ball rolling for a lot of things in the industry, and a lot of the way you do video games and you think of video games. And I would never argue that Gregg Mayles is, you know, at that very tippy top of the hill. But I think what I really appreciate about Gregg Mayles is that he might catch that snowball that Miyamoto got rolling. It's a snowball now. I said ball, but you know, it is a snowball just getting bigger. And as creative talent through subsequent generations adds to it, makes that ball larger, what Gregg has added to it, what he, like the little pieces of debris, the twigs and leaves that he stuck in it, I find that to be the most fascinating additions to Miyamoto's own legacy. And the way Gregg Mayles says, like, this is the way I could do it. This is the direction I could take things in. It resonated with me like no other video game ever did at a very influential age for me. And
yeah.
So a lot of this, I will have to say up front, I cannot speak to the work of Gregg Mayles and have any like subjective reasoning. It's all just this emotional adulation that I feel. So I am probably not the best person to actually intellectually break down the works of him and to say like, this is why I think this works. but I can at least convey my passion, and why it strikes such a resonant chord with me.
Yeah. I think that there are certainly many objective things we can point at within Gregg Mayles' work, including, but especially, Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie, and Grab by the Ghoulies. I feel like those three, like, touchstones kind of define what this guy's design perspective is more than anything else. Although that's already over 20 years old, so he's been active for 2 whole decades after that point. But those three groups of games are particularly quintessential, I guess, of the design philosophy of Gregg Mayles. Do you want to go through? I see here you might have a plan to go through some of what he did, just to list it all out.
Yeah, because I feel like it's important to break down for everyone, because I think most people who listen to the Kongversation on a regular basis, they know who Gregg Mayles is. But I do think it gets a bit muddled what Gregg Mayles has been lead designer on, what he's had a hand in. I think a lot of times they just think of him as the Donkey Kong and Banjo guy, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. So, like I said, Battletoads Arcade, Donkey Kong Country. He did some stuff for Rare before that, but those were the games where he really stepped at the forefront and took charge. And
I know he was involved with the first Battletoads game,
yes,
but I don't know if he was. I don't know who the director would have been.
He's uncredited for the original Battletoads, but I think, I don't know how much he contributed, but I know he did contribute to it. But
would that have been a Chris Stamper directed game?
I honestly can't say for sure. I don't know.
That would be my guess, but I don't know.
I think the time period it still might have been, that's plausible, but my knowledge of Battletoads is sadly a bit lacking, because it is kind of before my time. It's before I really started paying attention to Rare, and I started hanging on their every game. So it was Donkey Kong Country that brought me to the table. And from there, I followed Gregg Mayles' career even when I didn't know who Gregg Mayles was exactly. So Gregg would go on, follow up Donkey Kong Country with Donkey Kong Country 2. And then he moved on. He left the Donkey Kong Country series behind, moved on to the game Dream, which would evolve over several iterations, but eventually become Banjo-Kazooie. And he followed this up with Banjo-Tooie, and then went on to make Grabbed by the Ghoulies. Following Ghoulies, Gregg would work on Viva Piñata, and that template he helped lay down for Viva Piñata was carried forward by others with Trouble in Paradise, but Gregg didn't personally oversee Trouble in Paradise. It's often bandied about as a Gregg Mayles game, but he wasn't actually directly involved with it, because he moved on to Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. And he's also been credited for design on the Kinect Sports trilogy. His most recent success was Sea of Thieves, because he was the lead designer on that game in its earliest days before Mike Chapman fully took over the role. But he was the one who laid down a lot of the foundation that I feel has made the core gameplay of Sea of Thieves such a success. I mean, we're 6 years strong and the game is still growing. So it's honestly one of his biggest success stories. Sea of Thieves. Now, last we heard, he's moved on to Everwild, trying to lend his magic touch to that project. Now, those are the games he's, widely known for, or that are held up as Gregg Mayles games. But it's important to also say, Gregg has pitched in on games that aren't considered his projects. Donkey Kong Country 3, while not his game, reused a lot of his unused ideas for Countries 1 and 2. He lent his design touch to Donkey Kong 64, specifically the King K. Rool fight at the end of the game. He did additional design for Conker's Bad Fur Day. I'm not sure what he contributed there, but he does get mentioned in the credits. So it's interesting. I haven't really thought about it, like what parts of Conker feel like Gregg Mayles bits. It might be.
I have some ideas,
yeah.
but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I would like, what comes out to me is the heads-up display UI in Conker's Bad Fur Day is very minimalistic, in the same way that a Donkey Kong Country game might be. When you collect a piece of health, there's the like slide on screen that like, hey, you got the chocolate, and then it slides off screen, and then you don't see anything on the screen most of the time. Yeah, that feels very Gregg Mayles-y.
But again, how much of that was directly Gregg, or how much of that was just the influence from Gregg that had been,
or like the UI guy on his team, as well. Like that could have. It's very hard to say. Very hard to say.
Saber Wolf for the Game Boy Advance, which is a game we'll be discussing in a couple months here on the Kongversation for its 20th anniversary. Not his game, but the concept, the original idea for it, the structure of it, is something he came up with and pitched, and they just ran with it. So Gregg is very influential, even when it's not directly his thing. His presence, I feel, is always being felt. And obviously, and I just want to say this up front, because we are starting this series, this DKU Architects series, with Gregg Mayles. And I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about how Gregg Mayles makes my ideal video games. Like, I'm a Gregg Mayles kid. He's basically my second father. But I love a great deal of Rare games that Gregg didn't work on. No, I mean, like, I've often said that the Mayles team is my favorite team at Rare, but Diddy Kong Racing and Star Fox Adventures, those are two of my absolute favorite games of all time, and that was Lee Schuneman's team. So it's not just Gregg. And even with the, like, going down the timeline, the handheld team at Rare, which has a lot of hands in it, appropriately enough. I mean, Paul Makachek, Gary Richards, that's one of my all-time favorite Rare teams, is that handheld team. Like, they produce so much underappreciated, overlooked gems that I go on and on and on about with my capacity at DK Vine. And so, yeah, like, it's not just Gregg that made Rare such a special studio. I mean, to this day, but I do feel like Gregg is the obvious starting point, because so much of what drew me into Rare in the first place, Gregg had a hand in. And so it's the last time I'll bring this up, like, hey, it's not just Gregg. We're not just saying he's solely responsible, but yeah, like, Gregg's ideas and his vision, just like Miyamoto cast a shadow over the entire industry, I feel like Gregg does the same with Rare and its legacy.
Yeah, I think that the lasting influence of Gregg Mayles' design and artistry is going to be a lot more subtle in the way that people talk about it. And it's going to be a lot just quieter in general in the ways that it influences other games. But it will be felt. It will definitely be felt for a long time. And if you look at the actual releases that Rare as a studio has put out, starting with like Viva Piñata going forward, there was the DS Viva Piñata game, which was the portable team. And there was Rare Replay, which was not led by Gregg Mayles, but is also not a new game. Every other thing since then has been a Gregg Mayles led thing. So even though I think we're drawn to talking about Gregg Mayles design in the sense that it was this like 1990s Nintendo thing, the last 15 plus years of Rare's output have been very specifically Gregg Mayles led or influenced. Like Everwild was going to be the first one in a while that wasn't, and then now it is again.
Yeah, and then they basically just had to call him in. And I can't speak to what's happening with Everwild, but I do feel like look, we just need to bring in Gregg to kind of shore it up, maybe. And I can understand that. Like, as excited as I was to like, ooh, it's going to be a Rare game outside of that bubble, outside of Gregg's purview. I'm also not going to turn up my nose that they brought him in, because yes, I want to see what he can bring to something else. And he's very rarely had ideas that didn't gel with me. You know what I mean? Even games that were controversial for their time, like Nuts and Bolts, I still have come around on, because it just wasn't what I was looking for at that point in time, at that point in my life. I can now look back and say, wow, Nuts and Bolts was ahead of its time.
Yeah, Nuts and Bolts was ahead of its time. I think that Nuts and Bolts is held back in a lot of ways for very specific things that I think are definitely fair to bring up. They are real and part of the game and are hard to ignore. Including a few mechanical things, a few story things, just, kind of across the board. But there's also something peeking through in Nuts and Bolts that, we saw it just last year. In one of the major nominee getters for Game of the Year across all the different awards was The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which is sort of based on it. Like, talking about Miyamoto being sort of like the grandfather of modern video game design, and then Gregg Mayles very shortly after that coming and being influenced by him and starting his own thing. This is a Zelda game.
Yeah.
That someone on the team definitely played, appreciated, and responded to Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, an Xbox 360 game in Japan.
Right.
Like, that happened. That had to have happened. Some things I think are, you can look at them and say like, well, this is a pretty similar idea. It could have evolved in a vacuum to be, to get at the same idea. So they took the same path to get there. This isn't one of them. I really think that someone on Tears of the Kingdom, maybe the director of the game, Furukawa, maybe not Furukawa, Fujimoto, one of those guys, played Nuts and Bolts and responded to it and liked it, and it influenced a very, very successful game. Like, it's proof that there was something in there with Nuts and Bolts, and I think that's what they were trying to get at with that game. And some other aspects, I mean, I said that already. Some other aspects hold it back, but with every Gregg Mayles game, I think there's something that you can pull out of it that is very, very exciting and usable. And we've got like golden examples that everyone sort of agrees are pretty cool, like the first two Donkey Kong Country games or Banjo-Kazooie. Most people would, I think, agree, like, oh, there's whatever they're going for there is working for me, and it is nice, even if it's not my favorite kind of game. But things like Grab by the Ghoulies and Nuts and Bolts, and even that first like few months of Sea of Thieves before people kind of came back to it when things were added and progression was added and things like that, have something in it that I think is really profound, and it just wouldn't have been released if it didn't have that thing in it.
Yeah, and to talk about it is overlooked, like the influence of Gregg Mayles. We like we said with the Beatles, like you can keep going back and say, well, this is what influenced them. This is what influenced them. Like everybody has a creative muse when they're just starting out. So, I mean, we can go back into the dawn of humankind. But, yeah, now, like, not just Tears of the Kingdom, but also Super Mario Odyssey. You saw a lot of people bringing up how they were incorporating banjo elements into that, like Banjo-Kazooie 1. And I think that is something that does get glossed over, does get overlooked, how much of Rare's output now influences Nintendo in turn, and how much of that is by Gregg Mayles' hand or his brain. So, yeah, it is something that doesn't get brought up often, because a lot of times, especially being at this for as long as I have, I'm in defensive mode, because I remember a time when the games of Gregg Mayles were being torn asunder in online video game discourse because they did not follow the tried and true formula of Nintendo, because they did different stuff. And so I'm always just like, no, this is why I like them. And then I'm just completely overlooking that, yeah, an entire generation or two of game designers, of developers like them as well, and now are incorporating them into their own works. And so we're well past the point where you have to defend any of this, because I think it's universally held that Banjo-Kazooie is one of the gold standards of 3D platforming, that the Donkey Kong Country games do bring a lot to the tried and true 2D platforming genre. And even...
Yeah, and I think especially now, you're seeing a lot of new nostalgia for Viva Piñata.
Yeah.
As a... what the kids today might call a cozy game or a wholesome game. Which is a bit of a divisive categorization, actually. But
is it divisive? Because I like it. I like that categorization. I don't have a problem with it.
Wholesome game? Yeah, it's not a conversation for this episode, but wholesome game is often, yeah, you know what? Actually, I won't do it. But
I almost baited you.
There is divisiveness about the category name. But the kind of farming or very like maintenance based stuff you'll see in a lot of games that are inspired, I think, first and foremost by things like Harvest Moon.
Yeah, I was going to say Harvest Moon.
Yeah, Harvest Moon and like Animal Crossing have given birth to this new genre of thing. And you're starting to see some like Viva Piñata aspects come back into the fold a little bit now as well. And I wouldn't have expected that when Viva Piñata came out. Viva Piñata to me felt like, looking at it from afar, because I did not have a 360 yet, it felt like, oh, they're trying to do a Pokemon. They're trying to do, you know all the Piñatas, you know their names, you get excited about them. Now there's a TV show. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's going to be a card game. Maybe they're going to open up a real life candy line. They didn't do that.
They didn't do that.
It feels so obvious.
It does, but at the same time, I remember, and Viva Piñata came out at a time where I was sort of drifting away from not just Rare or DK Vine, but just the video game industry as a whole. Like that was when I was trying to like make a go out of it. You know, I'm out of college. I'm going to go make my career, and it's time to put away childish things. This won't be my life. And it was only a couple of years, sort of a long weekend, if you will. But I remember how much Viva Piñata struck a chord with people and how much it took me by surprise. And it never reached the like sales success they were obviously pining for. Like they wanted it to be Xbox's Pokemon, sure. But I do think that game, those games had an audience, and I think they're kind of underappreciated nowadays.
You know, this is a very specific Gregg Maylesian thing, because I think that Xbox wanted it to be their Pokemon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Gregg Mayles didn't care about that at all.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely
the
not.
impression that I got was, no, it's just the game that it is. If you want to sell it in a certain way, go ahead. Which I'm sure Xbox was excited about, because the one they got from him previously was Grab by the Ghoulies, which there really is no... Oh, it's like this thing. Like, I guess it's like Luigi's Mansion, kind of, but it's not like even that much isn't selling that many GameCubes.
In that it's a video game, yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's a video game set in a haunted house that utilizes technology derived from the fact that now we have a right analog stick as well as a left analog stick, and you can use it for more than just camera.
Right.
That's how both of those games sort of came along, which is a lot. It's weird that like internal Nintendo and Rare were both told, hey, we're going to have this controller. It's going to have 2 sticks on it, one for the left thumb and one for the right thumb. And they both came up with a haunted house game to broadcast that idea. I don't know what it is about that, but that's interesting.
I mean, Rare had a hand in helping to design the GameCube, so maybe first and foremost, they were like, this has to be conducive to haunted house style gameplay.
Yeah, but like Nintendo was down with it too. Like Nintendo had Luigi's Mansion. There were some other things around the same time that were not exactly haunted house, but maybe more Halloween-ish in general. That also, like, there's a real link here that I noticed maybe a year ago between when developers first got access to using 2 sticks at the same time, and like it happened a few years earlier on PlayStation because they had the DualShock controller with the 2 sticks, and like haunted house or Halloween-ish type games. Like it's a weird thing where like with the Wii, you have the motion controls being added into the mix, and all of a sudden you want to do sports, and then Kinect does it, and then they also do sports, and PlayStation had their own sports things. But to me, motion controls doing sports, that makes sense. The second analog stick means haunted house. I don't know how that happens. I don't know how you get there, but it is something that happened.
It also explains why the Wii was so much more successful than the GameCube, because sports are just inherently
haunted houses.
Yeah, they have inherently more appeal, and the GameCube was just too scary.
That's true. That's just true.
Yeah. So Mitchell,
my dad will watch a sports game anytime. He very rarely frequents haunted houses.
It's true. I can say
once a year at most.
I can say the same thing for my dad. Yeah. So,
yeah,
I wanted to get different perspectives for this episode, but I didn't go too far outside my bubble. I asked DK Vine staffers, I asked members of the DK Vine inner circle, and I asked some of our close friends what they thought of, first and foremost, when they thought Gregg Mayles' game. And I realized, like, asking DK Vine staff, asking people in our Discord server, like, obviously, I might have my thumb on the scales a little bit because I have spent the better part of my life on DK Vine talking about what a Gregg Mayles game is. So that's going to perhaps indirectly influence people down the line, just like Miyamoto influenced Gregg Mayles, just like Gregg Mayles is influencing younger developers today. But all the same, I did want to get outside of my headspace a little bit. So I asked them, and I thought maybe we could share some of their responses.
Sure.
All right. So this is from Cameron. You know Cameron. Cameron.
I know Cameron.
Yeah. Cameron said, thinking about a Gregg Mayles game, settings that feel fully realized, functional, lived in, or otherwise purposefully constructed, and characters that feel like they have lives off screen. Characters and settings can call attention to the artifice of being in a video game, but will do so in a way that feels characterful in and of itself.
I think that's a great point. I think that around the Super Nintendo and N64 time period especially, Nintendo's main rival had become the PlayStation. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what Nintendo was doing versus what PlayStation was doing, and divide them by priorities in their design. Nintendo is always about mechanics and like what you're actually doing on the sticks, making it feel good on the sticks, so to speak.
Just like haunted house games feel good on the sticks.
They feel good on the sticks, yeah. But they, like the mechanical aspect, the systemic aspects of their games, and it's why they've always been more action oriented versus like a turn-based RPG. That's not. It's weird when they do it, right? Because you kind of assume that they're just more real time, like make the player do something now that is a fun toy in and of itself. Like the verb is a toy. Mm-hmm. That's what Nintendo's always been about, and that's like the nucleation point for their games. And they can spread out from that point and make a game that is more story driven, like some of the Zelda games, or more like experiential, like some of the. I guess you'd say maybe some of the Star Fox games. But they are primarily like about the action of what you're doing. And then what PlayStation and Sega to a lesser extent, but PlayStation for sure, came out, and all of a sudden some of the top selling stuff were like these Final Fantasy games, or these Metal Gear Solid games, or these racing games that were much more about the experience of racing than like the gameplay of it. Mm-hmm. And there's exceptions to this for sure, but a lot of what had come out on the PlayStation at that time to rival what Nintendo was doing, and a lot of people were really clicking with this, were games that were experiences.
Yeah.
First and foremost, more than something you play. I like Final Fantasy VII has continued to be one of the most important games of all time, and I think it has, excuse me, it has everything to do with people remembering the story of Final Fantasy VII and what it felt like to be in that world, and the characters, the characterization of characters like Cloud and Aerith and Sephiroth, and almost nothing to do with playing the battle system of like Final Fantasy VII. That it barely matters. It's there. It's good. It's fine. But like that's a big PlayStation directed thing. And what Rare was doing in especially like a Gregg Mayles game, and I think what Cameron has pointed out here is very central to this idea. It's almost Nintendo's bridge into a little bit more of that kind of experience-based stuff, while still being itself founded on the action and the mechanic first approach that Nintendo had been developing since the 80s. It's sort of tying that into the idea of like, well, I like jumping around as Mario much more than jumping around as anything on the PlayStation, but like, can't we do that in a place that's fun? Can't we do that in a place that feels like I could learn more about the people or things that are there? And that's, to me, what Banjo feels like. It feels like a Nintendo style game that is allowed to have the same kind of rich experience in its setting and feeling like you're in a world that PlayStation was really trading on at the time.
That's interesting. That is very interesting, because I have never been a Nintendo kid. I was just weaned on Mother Nintendo's milk, right? I talked about it the other week with Josh Wallen, the Geek Critique, when he was on the show, and we spent over 4 hours talking about Super Mario Brothers 2, but we also got into like the formative years of my gaming self, and getting a Nintendo Entertainment System in 1988, and just how that really defined what video games were to me. But there was always this yearning on my part for something more, and I could never articulate it. I could never figure it out. And when you say that Rare's games and the design of Gregg Mayles was kind of the bridge to this non-Nintendo-like gameplay while still keeping the core fundamentals in place, that taught me how to play video games, that what video games were. It didn't eschew that, but it also didn't let itself be defined by that. And I've never thought about it in those terms until you just laid it out for me. Just blew my mind a little bit.
I think it was a bigger deal for the Nintendo 64 era than it was for the Super Nintendo era, because for the NES and the Super Nintendo, well, for like the first half of the Super Nintendo, you really had the competition with the Genesis, sure, but Genesis was trying a lot of the same approaches, just in their own kind of way, where I think PlayStation is actually a fundamentally different approach. But like those two consoles got everything that mattered for the most part, unless it was a first party Sega thing. And then, when PlayStation became the de facto owner of third party experiences, and the Nintendo 64 had Nintendo stuff, Rare stuff, and like some Treasure stuff, I guess, like some things here and there from some other companies, and had to all of a sudden like offset the fact that, hey, first party Nintendo games are actually one kind of thing, and it's pretty mainstream. It's very accessible and approachable. Well, actually, it's not accessible. It's very approachable, not accessible. Key design difference there. But all of a sudden, we're not actually making games for everyone anymore. It's a lot of people. It's actually the most people you could do while making one kind of thing. But it's still not everyone where it used to be everyone. And PlayStation actually didn't have that problem. Like there really was something for everyone, to one degree or another. It might not be your favorite version of that thing on PlayStation. Like I think if you had a penchant for 3D platformers, then you were going to go to the Nintendo 64, but they were on PlayStation. Whereas if you had a penchant for RPGs, it was not the same thing in reverse. You just went to PlayStation.
Right.
So having that bridge into that other kind of game development that prioritizes experiential play and settings that really quite matter, and aren't Ocarina of Time, because Ocarina of Time does that thing, but it's the only thing that does
right.
That Nintendo was putting out at the time. It's super valuable, super valuable, and I kind of think that it would have been disastrous for the GameCube, and it kind of was, losing Rare and losing that approach, if it were not for the fact that Nintendo, I think, learned a lot from that approach and that Gregg Mayles directed style thing, where all of a sudden they, in their internal stuff, were trying it themselves a little bit more. Like the Zelda games for GameCube, Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, I think are both in very different ways, based on the charmingness of their settings. And Super Mario Sunshine is a Mario game that is, it's the first one since World that was like really not abstract in its setting. It was much more focused on like presenting a setting and an idea of, hey, we are here on Isle Delfino, and the way that there's a bunch of NPCs that just talk to you all the time, and it's set around this little town. That feels super rare. That feels very Gregg Mayles. And they kind of don't go back to it at all until Odyssey.
Yeah.
But that one right in that GameCube era, I think it was Nintendo leaning into the idea of like, oh, that actually worked, to try to expand a little bit into this other thing we weren't doing on the N64. And they're not doing it anymore for us, so we gotta pick up some slack there and look at how we can do it. Like Pikmin is a Miyamoto game,
yeah,
and the world vibes of Pikmin feel so specific, and like there's lore and there's it feels like you're in a place, and it's so focused on being a setting that. Like, I don't think Nintendo had ever done anything that felt as experience focused more than like play focused, like Pikmin, any time before Pikmin, at all. But Rare was kind of already getting into that vibe. Yeah,
for sure. So we're only 1/3 of the way through what Cameron said.
Sorry, Cameron.
Cameron also had two other points to make about Gregg Mayles. The second one was being unafraid to set aside core defining elements in an established series in the name of trying new ideas, usually resulting in each individual game in a series having a very distinct identity. And yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, the easiest ones to pull from are the 2 direct sequels he was in charge of, Country 2 and Banjo-Tooie. But like you said, even Battletoads Arcade felt wildly different from what had come before with Battletoads.
Mm-hmm.
Nuts and Bolts was, of course, just something completely different from what had already been established in Banjo-Kazooie.
Yeah, I've learned something that I think is pretty universal about planning out a franchise, like franchise design within video games,
Mm-hmm.
from Gregg Mayles' repertoire, which is that for storytelling, whether it be in books or movies or whatever, I think there is a natural human impulse to push for a 3-act structure. In fact, when we talk about a story, sometimes we use the phrase beginning, middle, and end to represent a story symbolically. And like, even in that way, we're saying, yeah, we like trilogies. We kind of point to them. Maybe it's a Western thing more than a human thing, but I don't know that. I'm not well versed enough in other types of like storytelling traditions to know if it's not universal. But it feels pretty intrinsic to just storytelling as a human activity. So in very story focused mediums, you'll see trilogies in books, in movies. It happens very frequently. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Godfather, whatever. And in games, it happens too, but I think that the games that like beset themselves into being trilogies are doing it more as a reflection of those other mediums rather than something in themselves that is a like a natural path. I think that the natural path for games and game design is 2 units, not 3. And if you look at Gregg Mayles' output, it doesn't actually come up very often that he only does 2, but if you look at what was planned to happen sometimes, or if you look at like the way something actually is, you'll see it all the time. Like Battletoads Arcade came out. Would they have made a second one if the arcade industry wasn't drying up? I kind of think they would. I guess we'll never know. But more concretely than that, you make Donkey Kong Country, then Donkey Kong Country 2, then you don't make a 3. You can give it to another team and they'll make a 3 because that's their number 1, actually. And then that team, after 3, they did Donkey Kong 64, and they didn't do Donkey Kong 64 2. They did Cameo.
Right.
After that. So like they were also on a 2-part thing. And then with Banjo, you do Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie. You don't do 3 right away. You do Grab by the Ghoulies. Grab by the Ghoulies did have a sequel that was planned for the second part of that pair, and didn't sell nearly well enough to justify it. Viva Piñata got 2. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is not really a 3. It's a 1 of a new thing.
Yeah.
And it very well could have gotten a sequel to like the Nuts and Bolts style of Banjo game, but didn't sell well enough to justify it. Connect Sports came out. Connect Sports Season 2 came out right after that. Rivals was a different thing.
Yeah.
And with Sea of Thieves, it gets complicated because like technically the second year of Sea of Thieves is like a sequel to the first year of Sea of Thieves.
It's a living game, so there's no like 1-to-1 comparison with anything that Rare's done prior to it.
Sure, yeah, but like based on when we think that Gregg Mayles might have stepped down from the creative direction position on Sea of Thieves and gave it to Chapman and then went somewhere else, I think it's very likely that the same kind of thing happened where like if you're to break down why it is this way, like this pairs thing. I think it's you make the first of something. And because it's the first of something, you have a lot of ideas about what it could be, and you need to bounce them off other people. You need to shave them down to edit for content. You need to try some things that aren't going to work. And like, it's an experimental process. And in the experimental process of making a new thing, you end up with this work table that's full of a bunch of other ideas you didn't get to use. And for the second game, what you do is you just start with those ideas. That's all it needs to be. You start with the ideas that you didn't get to use for the first game. You put them all together. You test whether they work or not. And if they don't, you throw them away. And if they do, they make the second game. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the second game, you don't really have the same work table full of ideas that you would have at the end of the first game, because you used them all.
Yeah.
And that's, we saw that recently with Zelda, with, like Breath of the Wild got a DLC expansion. So people were expecting Tears of the Kingdom, which is a very similar game, to have a DLC expansion. And they came out and said, no, with the sequel, we actually finished every idea we had for this style of Zelda game.
Yeah.
And I respect the hell out of that.
Yeah.
It's just a finished game.
So in my show notes, I specifically wrote down the term Gregg Mayles Wanderlust. Because I feel, specifically with Gregg, and this is, I think, the most frustrating aspect of Gregg Mayles. I, too, respect the hell out of it, but I have to say I'm of two minds about it, because intellectually, I respect the hell out of it. I would not want Gregg Mayles to just become married to forever sequels and to basically go through the motions and be like, oh no, I'm the Banjo-Kazooie guy. I have to come up with new Banjo-Kazooie games because Banjo-Kazooie is a lucrative franchise that can never die. Intellectually, like, yeah, Gregg, do what you want to do. Emotionally, I fall in love with Gregg's games, his characters, his world view, and I'm just like, yeah, give me more of that. Just keep giving me more of that. And the desire to never settle down with a franchise, with a series, after one massive sequel that just goes for broke. Like, that is what makes Donkey Kong Country 2 my all-time favorite game. That is what makes Banjo-Tooie, for me, one of the most interesting 3D platformers. Because if they just were like, well, there's going to be another one, so screw it, let's just get this out, it would diminish them. It would lose the impact of what they are. And I think the expectations were raised because Rare immediately had another team ready to go for Donkey Kong Country 3. Because they knew the Stampers knew what a lucrative proposition Donkey Kong games were. And also, they were kind of the caretaker of the franchise for Nintendo, so there was also an expectation that they keep making Donkey Kong games. So, Donkey Kong Country 3, I loved. That was Andrew Collard doing the design of that, but also taking a bunch of ideas that even Gregg couldn't implement in the second one, and running with them. And to speak of like the overall Rare philosophy that you brought up, how this is just commonplace in Rare. Donkey Kong 64 was originally Andy Collard's game as well. It's often talked about that it's the Country 3 team that DK64. That was a lot more true when it was going to be something completely different than the game it ended up being. When George Andreas took over and they had to get it out and just basically had to settle on a direction that was more or less mirroring what they did with Banjo-Kazooie a year prior. But yeah, Donkey Kong 64 might have been just that second Donkey Kong Country 3 then, and so on and so forth. And with Grab by the Ghoulies, they didn't get to do another Grab by the Ghoulies, a second 3D escape room beat 'em up game. But the ideas that we've heard that they had for it are just amazing to me, a fan of the original Grab by the Ghoulies. And
yeah, we have the phrase "need in the nuts."
need in the nuts. And
we wouldn't have that phrase if it weren't considered at one point to be a second Grab by the Ghoulies game.
Yeah.
And yeah.
But like I said, if you are a fan of any concepts Gregg Mayles cooks up, Gregg Mayles is but one person, and he can't just... I likened it to spinning plates, right? Like, what Greg will do is he will prepare the most delicious meal you've ever had and put it on a plate. And then he will get that plate spinning on one of those plate spinning poles that I don't know where you buy those. I've never actually encountered them in a while, but you've seen them. You know they exist. Poles for spinning plates. And Greg will get one plate spinning, and then he will move on to the next dish. And he will get that plate going. And will another team come behind him and keep that one plate spinning? Well, eventually, you're going to run out of teams. You're going to run out of people, time, resources for one studio. And some of those plates are going to stop spinning. And Greg's going to just keep going down the line with more and more delicious meals. But maybe you really like the taste of that one and you're in the mood for another one. Well, it's too bad. Greg's all the way at the end of the table now. He's spinning the Everwild plate. But what about the Banjo-Kazooie plate? What about the Viva Piñata plate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way, if there is a desire to continue these franchises, like I think there's a desire within us to keep seeing them. If there's a desire to keep them going, I think that the model that Donkey Kong Country 3 had done of like, you have this team do two things and then you move them on because that's your team that you really want to see new stuff from. But there's going to be another team that wants to do that thing. You put them on the third thing. Mm-hmm. And like that would be, I would imagine that's sort of the way to do it. I think that, I think that there's just like a natural kind of flow there.
But again, and this is also owing to how prolific Rare was at a certain point in time, where they were just releasing classic after classic after classic, and their output was hiding the fact of that they were just a studio, right? Like it wasn't like Rare. Rare was a bunch of different teams working under the same structure, the same on the same property, but it really did feel like they were capable of so much more. And eventually it caught up with them when game development became a little bit more time intensive and they couldn't just release 4 to 5 games a year. But it did set the expectations early on that, oh yeah, this is a new series from Rare and we're going to keep getting these and we're going to get new stuff as well. And hopefully we're going to keep getting that. Eventually time catches up to us and it just becomes improbable. And I would rather have new Gregg Mayles games than seeing Gregg Mayles creatively stagnant. But I agree. There is a part of me that also yearns to see what else you can do with Banjo-Kazooie.
Yeah, give it to me. I'll do it. You don't have to, Gregg Mayles. That's actually fine.
Right. Yeah, I'm at the point where, like, I've made my peace with the fact that Gregg Mayles will probably never work on another Banjo-Kazooie game again. I just want a Banjo-Kazooie game while I'm also getting Gregg Mayles games.
I should point this out that in the in the Twitch chat, Just Andre has made a very good argument here that the dual analog sticks they promote haunted house games in both Rare and Nintendo because the left analog stick represents the physical world and the right analog stick represents the spirit world.
I like that.
Movement on the left stick and perception on the right stick. It's pretty good.
Yeah, no, I've got the hairs on my arms standing up because I feel like we're making contact with the great beyond.
Really cracking the case.
Yeah.
Which is our other podcast that we do with Dustin.
So, Cameron had one final point about Gregg Mayles. Creative indulgence on a level far beyond what is mechanically necessary. Extra animation flourishes, development team in-jokes, innuendo, Easter eggs related to past projects, and a general sense of a lot of, that sounds funny, throw it in behind the scenes.
Yeah. I'm hesitant to say that's Gregg.
I don't think Gregg discourages it, and I think Gregg revels in it a little bit, but it's also, I'm sure, a lot of the people Gregg works with as well.
Yeah, based on how the Platonic games have come out, I would strongly wager that a lot of that, like, in-joking kind of, like, just development team references stuff were one of those guys. At least a lot of it. It's probably from everyone a little bit.
Yeah.
But that's for sure true. And one of the most important things that a game director can do is make the team and manage the team working together, having everyone on the same page. It's difficult to, if you have a big video game with maybe a group of like 10 environmental artists, on a modern AAA game, that it could even be more than that. If you have a bunch of people like that, to organize them in a way that they're producing art that makes every part of the game look like it could be part of the same world as every other part of the game, that's a tough thing. So the fact that there's this very cohesive thing coming from maybe even other members of the team consistently across multiple games is like that's pretty outstanding too, and that doesn't happen with every team.
So in my notes, I wrote this little bit about the meta humor of a Gregg Mayles game. And I, like you just said, I don't know how much of this is directly at the feet of Gregg versus people he's worked with who are either still at Rare or now at Platonic or have moved on to their own ventures. But I do think Gregg definitely has this, and a lot, especially everything up to, I want to say, Connect Sports. Connect Sports is kind of when you stop seeing this, but that was more a directional change at Rare than it was, I think, anything from Gregg's doing. So I wrote, the beautiful irony of Gregg Mayles, the great contradiction. Shut up, all right? I'm very passionate about this, Mitchell. Won't have you laughing at me.
Yeah.
I'm speaking from the heart.
The beautiful contradiction.
The great contradiction is the beautiful irony.
I'm so sorry.
Is that Gregg Mayles wants you to forget that you're playing a video game. Yet he will always remind you that you're playing a video game because his characters will generally always know that they're in a video game and will frequently comment on it, even making that part of their central character arc.
Yeah, it's definitely a direction. The Western game world, I think, has leaned heavily into immersion as a top priority in video games. And the Eastern, I mean, they do that a lot too over there. But like I think the more common idea would be consistency more than immersion. Like, you can look at something that's very gamey, but as long as the whole thing is gamey, it feels like a unit of itself. This is interesting because I think a focus on immersion is I can't really tell how much it's there across like all Gregg Mayles games, because I think Nuts and Bolts does not actually do that.
Well, yeah, Nuts and Bolts, as much as I give it its accolades belatedly nowadays, I will say, and I've just said, that the one area of Nuts and Bolts that holds me back from fully embracing it is the artifice behind its worlds. By design, It has this level of artifice that feels counterintuitive to what you would expect from both Rare and Gregg Mayles.
Yeah, with the artifice in Nuts and Bolts, I think it speaks to just how much of Nuts and Bolts really is the first of a new thing versus the third Banjo. Because if I saw another game where like, oh, this takes place in video game world, I'd be like, oh, that just is the setting of this place. So that's, it's whatever. That's what it is. That's its own thing. But knowing that there's like a real world as well, so this is a divergence from that, impacts Nuts and Bolts' ability to feel that way a little bit. Yeah, but still, I definitely agree. That's like a huge aspect of the of his games in particular. Just wanting the player to feel like they can really spend some time in this world, even if most of the games that he works on are single player campaign games that you go through and you finish. So normally the idea of like letting the player just hang out there for a long time is not actually a priority in those kinds of games. Mm-hmm. That's more of a priority in an online game, an MMO, or a living game. And now we've seen that in Sea of Thieves.
Yeah.
And maybe Everwild will be that way too. Who knows? We have no idea.
We don't even know what the game is, really.
There's
some salamander in it and vomits little babies. But yeah, I think that...
I think like you play as the babies.
I hope so. I likened it to this. There's this level of immersion. There's this level of really reveling in your environment that, and I speak to this as a Nintendo kid, right? Like your point about, well, the PlayStation was kind of doing this, and that's well and good, but there was a certain expectation on the Nintendo consoles Rare was developing for in the 90s, which is why there was all of these direct comparisons between their output and Nintendo's output. And like Rare and Gregg Mayles made you believe in a game environment, but they'd also tell you that this is a video game. The characters know they're in a video game. They're always running commentary on the fact they're in a video game. And I feel like that almost makes the allowances for where there has to be video gamey stuff that intrude upon that immersion. It's basically the game's way of saying, yeah, we know it's a video game, just roll with it. But we still want to make you feel real feelings from this. And somehow just threading that very delicate needle worked. And I don't know why it did, but it's definitely there in Gregg Mayles stuff, like through Viva Piñata, even. Like, Viva Piñata had a bit of that, for as much of it as a life simulation game, cozy, wholesome, as you said, there was still a little bit of that mischievous winking in there.
Yeah. With Sea of Thieves, I think it's interesting on that game because like it comes across much more in the form of other players being there.
Yeah.
So none of the NPCs really have to, and that game kind of just doesn't as much as some of the other games in that way that you're talking about here, because it's just because it's an MMO. It has other people who are very, very willing to remind you at any time that there's some like game-ish aspect of what's going on here, which feels pretty at home. I hadn't really thought about that before this podcast, of like how much of the specific style that he diverted from Nintendo's main style, like that new stuff, how much of that new stuff really lends itself specifically to online games.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. Hadn't really thought about that before.
So, thank you, Cameron. Jeff, you know Jeff Mitchell.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff.
We can skip this.
Well, I was gonna let you put Jeff's lovely velvety words in your mouth.
Okay. I'll do that for Jeff.
Okay. All right.
Jeff's first point is immersion versus diegesis, nature versus industry theme.
Well, Jeff with the vocabulary builders here. Thank you.
Yeah, we talked just now about the immersion versus in-game stuff feeling like games. But the nature versus industry theme, I think that's pretty huge. I like that this was, just skipping ahead a little bit, this was brought up by multiple people.
Yes.
As a very common thread of you play as these animals in a lot of the games, and there's a human element or like a militant element around the industry encroaching on the natural space. But Jeff says more words about it, so I'll let him say it through me right now. Industry being either technological or mechanical, but also just systemic ways of conquering nature/systems that stand in the way of freedom. The Grand Maritime Union and Flameheart's forces are both industry in this sense, even though they're both very different from the literal pollution spewing factories that the Kremlings and Gruntilda have, but they all represent a systemic conquering of nature and freedom in the name of some kind of cold profit motive. The hero is generally just a laid-back everyman that likes to have fun, and the villain stands in the way because they want to tame the world and profit off of it. I also think in gameplay, Mayles has a high focus on tools and their options for interactions. The interesting varieties of barrels in Donkey Kong Country games, the uses of Kazooie/general move pool in Banjo games, vehicle parts and nuts and bolts, everything in Sea of Thieves. He's giving the player a diverse toolkit and then coming up with with wide-ranging uses for every tool in the kit.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. That's equating the or not equating, but like juxtaposing the ideas of the narrative thematic stuff of nature versus industry with the mechanical stuff of like giving the player a bunch of tools, because you then let the player like do some industry with the tools. So putting those thoughts together, I hadn't considered that. Thank you, Jeff.
Yes.
For your time. Thank you for your time, Jeff.
Yes. Thank you for all of the times, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you for your times.
Yeah, nature over technology, like you said, it's something that a lot of the people we asked brought, like, that's one of the first things they thought of was it's a reoccurring motif in Gregg Mayles' games. And
yeah,
I jotted down, independent of them, Gregg Mayles, I compared him to Miyamoto. But here I said, Gregg Mayles is a modern-day J.R.R. Tolkien. Because Tolkien also wrote heavily. One of his biggest themes was the Industrial Revolution and how it was wrecking the world, and how humankind was losing their way the more disassociated they became from nature. And, you saw that. I don't know how familiar you are with Lord of the Rings, Mitchell.
Oh, I've seen it.
You've seen it, okay. The Saruman, played by Christopher Lee, i.e. Dracula. Count Dooku.
It's my favorite Digimon.
You know Count Dooku. You're a Star Warsman. And
yeah.
Saruman, he tore down the forest to, like, create his factory of warfare. And you see this a lot where in Gregg Mayles' ideology, technological progress is bad when it's not in harmony with the natural world around it. He's not saying that technology or progress is in and of itself bad, but when you do it in a way that actively harms the world and separates one from the nature around them, that's when it becomes unethical. That's when it becomes the difference between heroes using barrels or the animals around them in a harmonious way versus factories or any attempts to claim dominion over the land or exploit it.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe another aspect of why Nuts and Bolts kind of feels like an outlier a little bit in a lot of these ways, because it is so industry. It's like you're on the side of the industry now, making cars and things and exploring these unnatural worlds. Yeah.
I mean, you're being confined in these domes, so it's not like that influence is spreading out, but yeah, like Jeff is right. Like there's the monarchies, the soulless corporations, just straight up evil people. And then you've got the heroes who are from the land, from the soil. They will have technology that's built up from it, not paving over it. They will ride on the animal steeds. Banjo and Kazooie, they will often transform into other animals or use their own animalistic attributes. You know, Kazooie's got her eggs, her feathers to their advantage. I mean, Banjo sometimes wears shoes, and that kind of is an outlier, but...
When does Banjo wear shoes?
Oh, he doesn't. Kazooie wears the shoes, you're right.
Oh, okay.
Banjo keeps his toes free and clear, but yeah, like their power-ups are usually in tune with them as a bear and a bird versus, you know, let's grab a gun. Let's just fucking grab a gun and start shooting.
Yeah, like Banjo or Donkey Kong lives in a tree house, and Banjo lives in effectively like a hobbit house, kind of.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. And like Cooper is just walking around with his girlfriend enjoying nature until he's forced into a house for a bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's...
Yeah.
Yeah. I asked Gibbon, and Gibbon, she said her impression of Gregg Mayles' games, and this is very succinct compared to the others, something kind of goofy. Like, all of his games have a certain sort of vibe to them, for the most part, you know? Something a bit Looney Tunes to them. So that was Gibbon. That's what she had to say. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how much I agree with that per se. Like, yes, there is a certain mirthiness to Gregg Mayles' games, but I wouldn't equate them to Looney Tunes. Per se.
I think there's something there, especially in the N64 era. There's a lot of squash and stretch.
Yeah.
Like, that is one of the things I think I would equate, or I would give that to the animators.
Yeah.
First and foremost. But there is a recurring choice, I guess, over this person's history, really until Sea of Thieves and then Everwild, to prioritize working with these very cartoonish characters. And even in Sea of Thieves, they're still fairly cartoonish, if not toned down a bit. But, you know, talking toads and then talking, I almost said donkeys, gorillas, and
talking Donkey
bears
Kongs,
and birds. Yeah. And, like, Cooper's basically Bugs Bunny. All the piñatas are their own little animals.
And you're right, like Sea of Thieves itself, the art style is a bit more abstract than you would see in a lot of contemporary counterparts. And that allows for a certain elasticity in what you can do in the game world. We talk about how immersive Gregg Mayles' games are, but they're always sort of reality adjacent. There's this certain freedom that you want to give yourself where you can have a little bit more cartoonishness to it without breaking that immersion. Like, I would say Conker goes full on Tex Avery style Western animation, whereas Gregg Mayles maybe just has one foot in it, but keeps the other foot rooted in the natural world, which allows for a happy medium.
Yeah, Everwild feels the least like it so far, at least from the trailers that I've seen.
Those trailers also predate Gregg Mayles coming onto the project, though.
Right, yeah. Maybe the Everwild that we get is going to end up being like the difference between 12 Tales and Conker's Bad Fur Day. Yeah. And we get a completely different Everwild.
But yeah, okay, I'm sorry I sold your opinion so short, Gibbon, because the more I think about it, even in Sea of Thieves, you can load pirates or their pets into cannons and just fire them out across the ocean, and it's just played for laughs. There is that allowance for that level of madcap mayhem that you see in a lot of other AAA games of this era, now quadruple A games, where it has to adhere to a certain reality, and then that gets into the uncanny valley a little bit, which Gregg Mayles games have never really had a problem with because they are reality adjacent.
They are reality et Jason. Who's next?
So the next, anonymous friend of the show have some thoughts, and that is, and I'll read this. I'll let you handle the next one, Mitchell. The first thing that comes to mind in Gregg's games, an overarching motif of nature needing to stand firm against technology. We've already covered that.
Did it. Next.
Did it, yeah. To qualify, I'm thinking of a Gregg Mayles game as being Battletoads Arcade, DKC 1 and 2, Dream, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, Nuts and Bolts, Saberwolf GBA, Ghoulies, Viva Piñata, Kinect Sports, Sea of Thieves, Everwild. Covered it. And I think that...
Come on, buddy.
And I think that animals can help you just as well, if not better, than technology as a reoccurring theme. Bam! Did it. Yeah. But also, and this is new. This is new. We haven't touched upon this. We're getting into some new terrain here. But also, family dynamics are ultimately loving, but also deeply dysfunctional and argumentative.
Yes. Yeah, this is huge. There's a storybook or fairy tale like aspect to a lot of these games that we're talking about. That makes it feel very song-like, very classic Disney-esque in some ways. Until like the darkness comes out. There's a bit where the darkness starts to come out, and you go to this beautiful Christmas world where everything's a snowman and there's presents and candy everywhere. And then you find this family of polar bears, and the dad has neglected to bring home the kids' Christmas presents because he is drunk.
Well,
and a bad father.
I think he was coded as being drunk. I don't think it was ever expressed that he himself was a drunk.
It is the design intention that he's drunk. It's definitely supposed to be that. I think they say he's eaten too much, but you know what? People who have eaten too much can keep going. Usually.
It's overconsumption.
Keep going. Yeah. And just little things like that come out all the time. The fact that like, oh, you're engaging with this natural world. You're finding the fauna of a local area and caring for them. Sometimes though, you need to squish a camel as hard as you can in order to have its water. And sometimes you're reminded that your grandfather gorilla, or possibly father, who I don't even remember where we've left that, is just not excited about your accomplishments at all and constantly downplays everything that you are. Sometimes maybe there's child sexual abuse going on in a mansion. Who's to say when the darkness is going to come out of this child's game? But it will. Yeah. It will, inevitably.
Yeah. Another point here to further clarify the point. Gregg dads, which is how it was put to us, Gregg dads. Gregg dads are tough love dads, while Gregg's husband-wife relationships are fractious and bickering, which I feel is reflective of sort of the stereotypes of the English middle class. There is...
Yeah, it's a very like Monty Python approach to like family tropes in comedy.
Yeah, and you see this throughout the rest of Rare and now Playtonic's output. So I don't know how much of this is Gregg or how much of this is actually just universal among the experiences of the creators, but there is this slice of life reality to it that these are people with problems and issues. There's a lot of love between them, but there's also just the small pressure points of coexistence that are often played for laughs in things like sitcoms. And they are put on display in Gregg Mayles' games as a way of making these ridiculous characters, often cartoon animals, seem more relatable and believable to the people playing them.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like
I believe them.
They feel like they're just folk like you and me. And it's one of my favorite things about all Rare games is how slice of life the reality is. Reality adjacent is the term I used, because you have these characters who just go on about their life. You know, maybe they just want to watch TV. Maybe they just want to stay in and check out their new DVD player. Maybe they're a little bit shy because they're tired of being hassled by door-to-door salesmen.
Yeah, and I will say it's not always like a dark turn, but it is always a bit of a turn. It's a turn toward some grounded, maybe cynical, but mostly like, I would assume an attempt to be realist worldview. Like in Banjo-Tooie, I think of Mr. Fit. This character in the very last level of the game. You only see him for a little bit, and then Nuts and Bolts pretends he's a main cast member, which is very funny to me. With Mr. Fit, he's this guy who's like devoted to running and jumping and just exercise. But they make him a little fat.
Yeah.
And I think there's something there of like showing this person who's like, the thing they're most interested in might not be the thing they are actually the best at or most respected in, but they're still giving it their all, because that's a real kind of person in life.
Right.
That's a real thing. And that much is, like, it's always a turn, not toward darkness or light, but toward showing, deeply flawed humanity. And
through the prism
people
of
trying
cartoon
their
animals.
best in the situations that they're given.
Yeah, for sure. There is something, like, for as much as we go on about how, like, Boggy is a terrible father, I like that there is that perspective. I enjoy that we have a view into a less than idyllic family life. A situation that maybe isn't picture perfect, maybe isn't straight out of a 1950s domestic sitcom.
Yeah, we did murder that ice cube, though.
And that also, that the compromises that are made a lot of times, you know, it's in the name of security or in the name of the greater good. Sometimes decisions are made that by politicians, by people who fundamentally have everyone's best interest at heart. I'm not saying all politicians do. I'm not saying most politicians do. I'm just saying, you know, occasionally decisions are made that you say that was the wrong choice. That was the like morally incorrect choice you made. But then Banjo and Kazooie will come at you and say, what other choice did we have? We had to get these jiggies in order to progress, in order to defeat this witch who has this device that can suck the life out of everything. So what is 2 ice cubes in the name of the entire population of this archipelago? It doesn't sit right with me, but I understand the philosophical argument behind it, and it fascinates me, and it intrigues me, and it makes me think harder about the world that I'm invested in.
Yeah, it's always a choice of like, if you see a struggling animal, do you feed a smaller animal to it that wasn't struggling?
Right.
Or like, what do you do? I guess I just don't go outside very often anymore.
No,
that's my approach.
I mean, it's the fundamental notion. Have you watched The Good Place? Talking about sitcoms.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the fundamental message of the show is, how do we be good people? What does it mean to be a good person when the world we live in is becoming rapidly more complex and convoluted, and every action we take has a negative consequence? Just something to think about in Gregg Mayles games, you know. It's good
Something
points.
to think about.
Good points. All right. Also, and we've touched upon this, the games will always be metafictional. The characters know they're in video games, but that doesn't prevent their cynicism from overriding their core personalities or prevent them from being heroic/noble deep down. We're getting deep. We're getting deep.
Yeah, I like that. I like that because I think that's a very apt way to respond to a world you know is fake. I think there are many people, maybe ourselves included, I don't know, Hyle, I don't know if we've actually talked about this, for whom the universe as a whole is something that we think might be ultimately meaningless. And also, maybe a simulation. Or maybe a cosmic error that is living on the film of a bubble and could pop as easily as it was blown up. But knowing that does not mean anything to me about its import and my ability to care about it.
Well, while I am not that far cynical about the nature of the universe, I feel that way about society, about our existence on this planet at times. And yeah, it is this dichotomy where I am trying to survive in this civilization because it's the only choice I really have, but I'm also not trying to let that hold me down or hold me back or from appreciating the greater beauties at work.
Very good, Hyle. Very, very good. Shall we continue?
Yeah, and that I see myself and my own anxieties and struggles reflected in Gregg Mayles games. So I'm glad this was brought up. I'm glad we went here, Mitchell. Stirring. The villains are always camp rather than scary. And usually, going back to the technology theme, either aristocracy or some form of scientist.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like Baron von Ghoul, I feel, is probably the prototypical, most quintessential Gregg Mayles villain.
Right.
Because K. Rool, I don't know if K. Rool is like a great example of fitting the theme so much. Because that was like designed. There's a lot of decisions in Donkey Kong that, even though Donkey Kong Country is a new kind of sub-series within the larger Donkey Kong series, there's a lot of decisions that were presumably made to work with Nintendo's thing.
Yeah.
Whereas for Banjo and for Ghoulies and Viva Piñata, it was just like pure the thing. Yeah, Baron von Ghoul is camp. He's not scary, but also he is horrifying.
Yeah, Baron von Ghoul does heinous things, and the implications therein. It's never fully illustrated why he's abducting children from the neighboring village. But, there, like, any implication you could think of would be dark. Because you just don't abduct kids.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just not something you do.
The reason that comes up in your head is that maybe he's a pedophile. And any other reason you try to come up with seems less probable than that.
Right. I mean,
it seems like a weaker answer to the mystery.
Yeah. And with Baron von Ghoul, he's old school English nobility. He's got this sprawling estate, Downton Abbey situation, if you will. And what is he doing with it? He's terrorizing the locals, lording over them. He's made a damn haunted house because he can't get over the loss of his wife. that being said, he's a fun villain because he's never portrayed in a very scary or imposing manner.
Yeah, I like when he wears pajamas.
Pajamas, yeah, and he's obsessed with World War II era aircraft for some reason. There's a lot in that character, but yeah, like, I think Gregg Mayles' villains are memorable and fun, and it's a nice balance of definitely wanting to defeat the villain, but never being turned off by the villain themselves. So, yeah. Finally, friend of the show said, on a more functional level, minimal HUD wherever possible, a deep desire never to make the same thing twice in a row without innovation, and naughty schoolboy humor. Yeah. Speaking to the HUD aspect, because that is the HUD, the HUD.
The hood.
The very first impression I ever had of Gregg Mayles' design philosophies, and of Donkey Kong Country in general, beyond just, hey, the graphics for this game are pretty sweet. I was taking the rented game home from Blockbuster Video, our old friend of the show, Blockbuster Video, and
shout outs.
I was reading the instruction manual. Two things popped out at me. One, the unusual level of world building for a Nintendo game, such as the progression of time for the original Donkey Kong characters. Unthinkable. I had never seen anything like that in a Nintendo game of its ilk. Two, this very memorable bit from the instruction manual, which I will read to you now. They show the game screen for Donkey Kong Country, and they've got a helpful diagram where they point an arrow at Donkey Kong, and that says you. And they point an arrow at a Kremling, and that says Kremling. And underneath it said, where's the score bar? Life meter? Speedometer? Scrolled off the screen where they belong. That's where. And I was like, I never thought about that, but yeah, fuck the speedometer. Like, I never knew I should have been angry about this, Mitchell. This swayed me. This changed my way of thinking. I was like, wow, you know what? Video games suck. Thank God for Donkey Kong Country getting that crap off the screen. And, it was just this weird thing where, as a very impressionable 10-year-old, it just completely converted me to hating clutter on a video game screen. And obviously I make allowances for it. You know, like, it's not like I'm a zealot when it comes to things on the screen that are necessary information. But it was my introduction to one of the underpinnings of Gregg Mayles' games. Immersion is key. It's not about playing a video game. It's about getting lost in the world of the video game itself. In fact, everything bubbles up organically from the game world itself.
Yeah, I like the idea that the speedometer is there, but it's off screen. Like, they did make one, and oh boy, if you could see it, but it's just off to the side.
Sometimes I wonder how fast Donkey Kong is moving.
He's moving one Donkey Kong per unit of time.
So this actually plays into our next comment from DK Vine Inner Circle member, Zeitchris T, or Astropipsy. Mitchell, why don't you go ahead and read this?
I always think of how he justifies a video game conceit. The Devil's Shroud is basically just an invisible wall, but he justifies it as something within the lore to make it make more sense. Yeah, I really like this.
Yeah.
I've tried, you know, in my work, I really try to do this as often as I can. But whenever you've got a game element, why not make it more than a game element? Why not? Yeah. Why not is because it's often very expensive, but, you know, do it.
I'm not familiar with much in the way of modern games, Mitchell, but speaking to the Devil's Shroud in Sea of Thieves, there's also the way the respawn cycle in Sea of Thieves is incorporated into the greater narrative and legend and lore of that game, where there is a ferry for your soul. You die and you sort of go to this timeout in the afterlife. And it's just there to allow for that cooldown time for when you get killed by another player, perhaps you won't just be hanging around. There is a penalty. It's a penalty box, but it's done in a way that makes sense for the maritime legends of the game. And it's just the simplest thing. But when I was at Rare in 2016 and I was first exposed to this when I was playing the game, I hadn't thought about how this would work. And I was just like, oh, that's such a Gregg Mayles touch. I said that out loud when I died the first time in Sea of Thieves. And yeah, it's, you see it a little bit less the further back you go, but it's interesting. Like, lives as the N64 era went on meant less. So in Banjo-Kazooie, they arbitrarily have these trophies, these extra life trophies. But what does a game over really mean? Not much. Donkey Kong Country, you have life balloons. And it's never really explained why. Like, what does this have to do with giving you an extra shot at this level? It was actually Retro who came like onto the formula long after Gregg Mayles had stopped making Donkey Kong Country games and said, oh, the balloon carries you back into the level. Like, that is a beautiful way of like taking the Gregg Maylesian philosophies and applying it to a Gregg Mayles formula in which it hadn't been applied previously.
One I think about all the time is in the move from Dream to Banjo-Kazooie. Once they decided that they wanted to play as Banjo instead of Edson, they had they were moving him around the screen, trying to figure out what feels good. And at some point they decided he should have a bit of like a flutter jump, like a double jump kind of thing, in addition to his regular jump off the ground. And they were trying to figure out how to make that make sense. And they decided to, because he had already got a backpack at the time, they had wings come out of the backpack to make the flutter jump. And then as they got further with that idea, the realization was like, oh, this could be a character. And that's how Kazooie came around. And that, like, it's gameplay first to a degree, but it's constantly moving over to make sure that the experience and in-universe vibes of what's happening also make sense and also conform to form one beautiful idea of what the branding of the thing can be, what the story of the thing can be, what the world of the thing can be.
Yeah, for sure. I think Kazooie is just one of the most brilliant ideas. Just, well, what if all these ancillary moves, all these additional moves were just the result of a second character attached to the first character? And then, like, characters mean so much to me. You know this about me, Mitchell. Like, I'm all about the characters, the cast of really anything that I'm into, but specifically video games, because they can be both your avatar and they can be your companions. And so to have this idea, I love the idea of adventures, but an adventure is never an adventure if you're just by yourself. For me, an adventure is something that is shared between, at the very least, two people, but ideally a community. And just having this additional character with Banjo, that makes the game doubly appealing to me.
It's two instead of one of them.
Yeah, just do the math. It just adds up. The equations don't lie. All right, so finally, Mitchell, we have a very evocative piece of prose given to us by Meinhard from the DK Vine Inner Circle. So I will read this, and I will try to do it justice. There is a hotel in Duluth, Minnesota, called South Pier Inn. It sits on a canal connecting the Duluth Harbor Bay to the Great Lake Superior, a true inland ocean surrounded by rocky land, shaped by volcanoes from before time and relatively recent, but very ancient glaciers. Over the canal is a towering lift bridge, a marvelous work of engineering, a structure that looks like it should be climbed and never be climbed. The hotel is on the side of the old Park Point neighborhood, not the touristy side. On a cold spring evening, walk this neighborhood and see nautical lawn decorations or kitschy gardens. Through a large window inside one of the houses, one can glimpse a portrait of Barnacle Bear, but I probably made that up. The hotel itself, a Cape Cod-type building that blends with the lake on a rainy autumn day. In its lobby, a model ship, a pair of binoculars, and a carafe of artificially flavored coffee, Norseman grog. Here I could bring a copy of Moby Dick and sit and read the opening chapter as if for the first time, and then page through a photo album of powerful inland storms. The clerk at the desk will offer a schedule of ships passing through. 1,000-foot freighters among them, cold metal monsters with deep, billowing horns. Suddenly, it's 4:56 a.m. as I stand by the North Pier Lighthouse, always cold damp, and I'm watching the first sunlight glow faint orange over the black horizon. A cup of Norseman grog warms my hands, and the sound of seagulls resonates chilly melancholy in my heart. Warmth of the coffee fades, the wind bites my exposed cheeks, and I turn back to walk across the lift bridge, whistling jig jib, jib jig, if I ever learn to whistle. In winter, I can look across the icy bay at a sort of Christmas village. Lights show across the harbor. Or close the shades and play a Gregg Mayles game on my Switch, warmed by the glow of the Erstas fireplace. That's what a Gregg Mayles designed game makes me think of, as a landlocked Midwestern American. So yeah, that, I think that actually speaks to a good point. I
wasn't sure if that was a Que Rico or something. I don't.
No, that was just the experiences of Meinhard. But I do think it speaks to how much reality adjacent is the term I use, but how much of the world, the natural world, or the comforting childhood nostalgia of a simpler time, we can see in Gregg Mayles' works. We can project our own lived experiences into it because there is something inherently relatable in every game he works on. Maybe not so much Grab by the Ghoulies because it's a damn haunted house, but you had to use that second stick somehow. So, Gregg Mayles' games, and then Rare's games, more broadly speaking, they gave me... I already loved nature as a kid. I loved being in nature, I loved animals, but my appreciation for it was only strengthened by Gregg's own appreciation of it. It kind of created a feedback loop in my developing brain, and I don't think I would be who I am today if I didn't have that guiding hand at a very formative time to say, yeah, that's how you should be. It's okay. Go take a hike. Get some fresh air. And yeah, so
I was a Boy Scout growing up, Hyle.
Did not know this.
I made it to Eagle even. I did it. I finished it. And I think because of some childhood relation to viewing that as a duty or responsibility, I had a hard time getting excited about the outdoors a lot of the time. I wasn't terribly shy or anything. I would just want to do whatever I was going to do in a clean place that's not dirty, gross, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that the fact that so many of these games are adventure games and so many of them are about these sort of wondrous outdoor experiences, I drew on that considerably as my way of getting that kind of stuff. Outside of the times when I would actually go and do it, but that it always felt like a little job. Being a Boy Scout felt like a little job.
I'm sure it was, because you had to tie all those knots.
I learned a lot of knots. I learned how to cook outside.
Yeah. A
bunch of handshakes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a yeah.
I was gonna say, here's my truth, Mitchell. I quit after the Cub Scouts. I did a year of that, and I was like, I am done, because I always had a problem with institutional structures that shackled me. And this has been a reoccurring thing throughout my life, where just like, I don't want to go the traditional route. I want to sort of just go my own path. And for me, I think because of that, nature was able to represent an escape, a solitude, a return to greater truths rather than the lies that civilization tells us. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Which is why the universe doesn't feel like a simulation to me, because the trees tell me otherwise. But I respect the point of view. And I keep myself open to the possibilities that we could just be in some sort of computer program or matrix. But so long as I can have the trees, I'm good. Just like...
Yeah, whatever the highest... My feeling has always been that whatever like the highest level wrapper on reality is, regardless of if it's divine or entirely natural or simulated or whatever, it matters so little to me, because the world in which I am is present and can act now and can be worked on by everyone within it.
And I feel that way playing Gregg Mayles games. And I like, that is not just me projecting my own likes onto them, because Mitchell, one of the highlights of getting to visit Rare in 2016, other than dying for the first time, was we actually got to sit in on a design class with Greg. And he actually got
that's cool.
He got to actually open up. It was mostly about Sea of Thieves, but, you know, he got to pick his brain a little bit. And I couldn't talk a lot about this trip for the longest time because I was under NDA, and so much of it applied to this one particular upcoming game. And I've been able to talk a little bit about it, you know, over the years, a little bit more as more things sort of fall out from under that purview of a non-disclosure agreement. But yeah, getting to sit in on this like design class with Gregg Mayles was really, really special to me. And Greg is a pretty shy guy. Have you met him?
Yeah, we filmed a video for the DK Vine channel.
That's right, you did. The Which Brothers Bear is Best. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Because I knew he was at a couple of the E3s you were at, where I first met you, but I didn't know if your paths had actually crossed because I wasn't thinking in terms of outside of E3. But
yeah, I hadn't met him in E3. I never saw him in an E3, but I saw him that year almost a decade ago. Wow. At the Comic-Con that year in San Diego.
Yeah.
Where they were talking about Sea of Thieves for the first time from like a design kind of way. And I stopped him and was very annoying in the hallway and told him that my favorite game was Banjo-Tooie. And he was like, I think I like it too.
Yeah. See, the thing about Greg, if you ever get a chance to pass him by on the street, and please don't like bother him too much, but he's a very shy guy. And I'm not talking about the Mario enemy, the Doki Doki Panic enemy. Greg is just very soft-spoken and very reserved. He's very nice, lovely man, but I do think too much praise and he kind of shrinks a little bit because he's very mild-mannered. He's very humble. Like, he may be aware of the gifts he possesses, but he doesn't let that define him. And so to get to sit in on this design class with Gregg is the only time I've ever seen him truly open up and come alive in a way that it felt like he was in his element and he was like taking command and just like you saw the inner workings of his brain finally spew out from his mortal self, from these fleshy confines. And the thing that he stressed above all else, which I then saw in all of his work throughout the now over 3 decades of games that he has designed, is that he talked about emotions and wanting to make players feel every emotion when you play, in this case, Sea of Thieves, but I do feel like this is applicable towards most of his work. He had this wheel of emotions, and I've looked this up. I've tried to find the exact one he had. I don't know if I found it because I can't remember all of the emotions on this wheel, Mitchell. I just can't do it. I have a good memory, but
I would wager he probably made it.
Well, they found the base for it online, and then I feel like they made a version of it and maybe added some extra emotions like horniness. I don't know. But the wheel of emotions was Gregg's defining principle making Sea of Thieves, designing Sea of Thieves from its earliest days. Like, the one thing he said, and this stuck with me, is the jubilation and like serene calm you feel watching a sunrise. We want that in the game. Just as important to the philosophy as feeling anxious when you see another player approaching, or feeling overwhelmed when large swaths of enemies, overtake you. And that speaks to, I think, what we were talking about earlier, the aspects that aren't necessarily necessary for a game to be mechanically sound.
It's when the darkness comes out.
It's when the dark,
like,
yeah.
With the earlier games, with the earlier Mayles games, you see it in the form of like, well, it's generally a happy place, but then look at this darkness come out, and it's like, I think with that you run the risk of being a little hot topicy, a little Nightmare Before Christmas, where you have like you're treating these dark things like your edge, like your accessory for your outfit, rather than interrogating them. But as certainly as the design ideals have gone along, rather than it just being like it's a happy place with a dark vibe, it's like, no, the reason it was a conflation in the beginning was always because of our desire to make you feel maximal. Just what can we make you feel with this work of art as you sit in front of your CRT television with your Nintendo 64 cartridge? Can we get all of the wheel? Can we get as many things as possible? So with a living game like Sea of Thieves, it comes out, I think, the strongest, the most in that way. But yeah, it was always there. It was always there in one way or another.
I mean, the first time I felt it really, the end of Jungle Hijinks, and we've talked about Jungle Hijinks, the first stage in Donkey Kong Country, and how much it's able to accomplish. In like, it's such an efficient use of gaming real estate. But one of the things it does is it makes you feel what Donkey Kong should be feeling. You go into that cave, that empty banana horde cave, and Donkey Kong solemnly shakes his head back and forth, knowing what he has lost. You progress through the level, and as you head towards the end, dark clouds move in.
Yeah, Gregg Mayles helped me with my homework once in my graduate program, because I was taking a level design class, and this was very shortly before, very like almost the pandemic. But I was in a level design class, and our professor assigned us take either Yoshi's Island or Donkey Kong Country 1 and do an analysis of the first level of those games and show what's going on. And I, using my very privileged position of having met Gregg Mayles before at that Comic-Con, I messaged him on Twitter, and I was like, hey, can you tell me what you were thinking about when you designed this level? And I did get the best grade in the class, and also turned that assignment into an article, which you also contributed to.
Oh yeah,
Hyle.
I did. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. So out of all of the list of people that I listed earlier, that the 10 people I would put in that highest echelon of video game design excellence, Gregg Mayles is the only one who's helped me cheat on homework before.
Right. You can't often do that with your homework, right? Like, you can't message Napoleon and say, what were you thinking at Waterloo?
Yeah. There's this thing where it's like a lot of the games that we were looking at were like just Atari classics or like NES classics or Miyamoto games very often.
Yeah. So
the idea that we could just call the guy up, it was probably not seen as a possibility by my professor. In my assignment, I included an image of these were the Post-its that were used to plan the level. And as you can see here, it diverged from the final version of the level in this way, that way, that way. And I got an email very shortly after I turned in the assignment, and he's like, how do you have that? It's not online.
Yeah. It's much better than the assignment I had in my screenwriting course, where I had to write a spec script, and we got assigned a spec script of a long-ended TV show. And we all got a different TV show, and I was assigned Dallas.
Ooh, okay.
And so let me just tell you though, Mitchell, there was a lot of scandal, there was a lot of intrigue, but I can't say I enjoyed that assignment.
Yeah, Dallas is an interesting one.
Yeah.
I've seen a lot of Dallas without seeing a lot of Dallas, if you know what I mean.
No, I had to actually purchase the pilot episode to get the underpinnings. And I was just like, I hate this. This sucks. But I know more about the Ewings than I care to admit. And why do I know that? Because I had to live inside JR and Bobby's head for 44 pages. So,
it's no Twin Peaks. You ever get into Twin Peaks?
Yeah, I've tried, and it's just, it's one of those things where the second season, I haven't been able to finish it. It just, it plateaus.
Yeah, the second season is tough.
Yeah.
The first season and then the return, I think, are what makes it.
And I haven't seen the return
fantastic
yet, and I want to get back into it, but it's one of those things where maybe I'll have some time now that I'm doing one conversation a week. Mitchell, we have some calls to take, and here's the kicker. So when we started this, we had one call. Andre popped in the chat, and I was like, go ahead and call in. So Andre called in 3 times. Three calls combined to one. Andre has a lot to say, and I feel like we owe it to Andre because this was Andre's idea. And then Snakefighter64, i.e. Jennifer, who called in about Steve Mayles, called back in about Gregg Mayles. And so while we were chatting, I covertly slid those into the show notes for you. So
excellent work.
So we're ready to go. Why don't we go and play that first call, the one you were anticipating?
Okay.
Hi guys, Carson here, aka Plastasm, and it's nice to see that there is a new sub-series going on the Kongversation. I think it's a great idea to do episodes about individual creators from Rare and other studios that have contributed to the DKU, and I think Gregg Mayles is a good first choice for it. In terms of what I'd like to see in the future from this little sub-series, I would love to see you guys cover Gary Richards' gamography. because I feel like he's probably among the most undersung and under-talked about game directors / designers at Rare. He did Conker's Pocket Tales, he did pretty much all of the handheld games he was involved with to some capacity until he left in 2008. And now he works at Playtonic, where he was level designer on Yooka-Laylee and The Impossible Lair. Absolute banger game, by the way. Anyway, I would love to see you guys do an episode on Gary or, what else we got? Chris Seaver, trying to think of the other directors at Rare. But pretty much any of them would make for a good episode. And I guess one last point is that I love Gregg Mayles' games. Tooie and Saberwolf are two games I consider my favorite. I consider to be some of my favorites. But I think Rare as a company is less interesting if you just look at it through the perspective of just Gregg's games. I love Gregg's games, don't get me wrong, but it's the tapestry of creatives. Your Lee Schunemans, your Gary Richards, everybody is what made Rare that incredible studio then and even today. Anyway, guys, I've been rambling on for a bit. I wish you a good episode and wish you best of luck on this new subseries.
Well, thank you, Carson. Plastasm. It's funny because I don't really listen to the calls beforehand. I'll just glance over usually the transcript that gets provided me through our call service, and I'll make sure it's relevant, and I'll make sure there's nothing nasty in there that we wouldn't want to get on air. And I was like,
how often does something nasty come through?
It's happened maybe once every 5 years. Not often, often, but occasionally I'll be
twice.
Yeah, I'll be like, "Oh no, that's hateful. We're just gonna sit on that one." But yeah, so I didn't actually I just saw Gregg Mayles, and I was like, "All right, plop it in." And the two names Plastasm brought up, I've already talked about as wanting to do in the future, Lee Schuneman and Gary Richards. So we're on the same wavelength there. And you're absolutely right. It's not just Gregg. And that's what I hopefully we were able to convey, is that Gregg is just part of a larger tapestry, but I also don't want to sell Gregg too short either. Gregg is responsible for so much of the magic that made me fall in love with Rare in the first place, and really has kept me invested in video games as I've aged. And I briefly, left it behind for a couple of years as I wandered the wilderness, and then came back to it. And it's my passion for his games, first and foremost, that made me reinvest and double down. It's no, this is what I want to do for my life. I want to celebrate his games and his coworkers' games. But yeah, I feel like I owe the most to Gregg, but that's not to sell anyone else short.
Definitely. And I think Gary Richards would be a very good one. As you said, Carson, Gary Richards is pretty undersung, but a very prolific designer within the Rare ecosystem. Who might be a good one for that podcast would be Freezer.
Yes.
Because it's a lot of the more handheld oriented ones. So that would be cool. Yeah. I feel the same way, Hyle, about Gregg Mayles' work, though. That's in my way, it's definitely set up my life, because when I played Banjo-Tooie, I was 6 years old, and I knew at that time I wanted to make games at something like this, something like Tooie, and I did that. So. To a degree, I'm still working on my Tooie game. It's gonna happen at some point. But yeah, there's just a lot to be inspired by in all of these places by all these people.
For sure. Well, but thank you for the call. I'm glad you are excited about the new sub-series. We won't be doing them too often. This isn't going to be a monthly occurrence, but when the time feels right, we will eventually tackle one of those names you mentioned. Okay, Mitchell, we owe it to this person for this episode, and this, I guess, episode sub-series, this whole conceit came from the mind of Andre. So why don't we give the episode over to Andre for the next 9 minutes? Because it's split across 3 calls. So, are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it.
Hey, Kongversation. This is just Andre calling in to talk about Gregg Mayles, and also to thank you again for the episode and for getting to it so quickly. I thought I'd be having to wait till like summer or something for this. And for taking my call in the middle of recording. Seriously, thank you. Alright, so I have to come clean. A big part of my reason for requesting this topic in the first place is that I myself don't think I have much of an answer. I don't consider myself educated enough on Gregg Mayles to speak really very decisively about it. So I wasn't even planning to call in myself for this. I was just going to enjoy the episode. But yesterday when you put out the tweet asking listeners to call in with their thoughts, the very first thing that leapt to mind is something that had come to mind in the past when I had considered what my answer might be. And that is the fact that in my very first Gregg Mayles game, Banjo-Kazooie, you can only defeat Grunty once per save file, and once you do win that boss fight, she just stays permanently defeated. There's no going back. And the fact that that little tidbit is where my mind went was, I found that really interesting because when you look at Gregg Mayles' body of work, it's very much the exception and not the rule. In Donkey Kong Country and Country 2, you can, just go back and fight K. Rool anytime you want. Sea of Thieves lets you just infinitely replay the tall tales, and even right there in the next game after Kazooie in Banjo-Tooie, there's an option just right there on the main menu to refight not just Grunty, but any of the bosses in the whole game just on demand. A really useful and I would argue really kind of necessary way of understanding like the creative identity at the core of Banjo is looking at it kind of intertextually with Super Mario 64, as you guys have done a lot in the past. Not really to Mario 64's benefit, but, famously, Mario 64's release was, really instrumental in helping to give the Gregg Mayles team a decisive creative direction to follow after Project Dream's development had already been through, 3 or 4 different internal reboots by that point. So one possible way to view Banjo comes from the kind of famous anecdote about Gregg Mayles that I will save until part 2 of the call. 1 second. All right, me again. That anecdote being that Gregg Mayles, of course, just really adored Mario 64, but couldn't seem to quite get over the fact that it would boot you out of the level every time you collected a star. He just didn't like how that interrupted the flow. So viewed through that lens, you could see Banjo as the team's attempt not just to iterate on and, really push everything about Mario 64 that had captured their imaginations, but also to, quote-unquote fix those things that they did not love so much about it. And so when you hold Mario 64 and Banjo up to each other, one of the big differences that sticks out is the fact that, unlike Bowser, Grunty's defeat at the end is permanent. And you can see that, all over the rest of the game, too. The whole reason that Mario 64 kicks you out of the level like it does might be, I don't know if this was actually why they did it, but maybe. The reason for that is to accommodate the fact that you can reselect a power star you've already gotten and do the whole mission around that star over again whenever you want, because, Miyamoto and crew knew that that's just something tons of players would take joy in doing and want to do. But in Banjo, even the jiggies are just like Grumpy, once you get one, you just have it correct, or you have it forever. Your progress is permanent. Granted, the music notes do not stay collected, but then, just fast forward a couple years to Banjo-Tooie, and suddenly collecting the music notes too is just a one-time event now. So bear with me a sec here, but I wish that back in the 70s and 80s, the term video game had not stuck, and that we were all calling them something else now. Obviously, the term video game is not going anywhere. It is way too deeply entrenched, but I do think it has had kind of a net negative effect on how people look at just the whole art form. Because, video games are every bit as effective, I think, at provoking a wide breadth of possible emotional experiences as, books or movies. And I think the medium's, at its best when it's taking full advantage of all of those different experiences it can provide. But, when you include the word game in the name people call it, it just kind of frames the whole medium in people's minds that the function is specifically to provide fun and nothing else. All right, one sec. I promise only one more call. Sorry it's going on so long. All right, here you go. So yeah, obviously I love fun. I love when games are fun, of course, but I'm also of the opinion that there's no benefit to limiting yourself to just that one sliver of emotional range just because we call them video games and the word game comes with a set of preconceptions. All right, so anyway, I bring that up because even though I think, this attitude of all games have to be 100% focused on fun 100% of the time is still a problem, it is definitely way less prevalent now than it used to be. Back in the days of Rare's partnership with Nintendo, there were very few games that shared Rare Games' emphasis on contextualizing all the gameplay elements as much as they could. On the console side, you had JRPGs like, Chrono Trigger. On PC, you had the Western RPGs like Fallout. And other than Rare and a handful of others, that was kind of it. But, fast forward to nowadays, the focus on contextualizing, the gamey parts of video games, that's just industry standard now. The rest of the medium is kind of caught up to what Rare was doing all the way back in the 90s. So this just happened, I guess, by cosmic coincidence. But the last episode about TikTok had me browsing the two Banjo wikis you guys talked about afterwards. And while I was reading, I stumbled on a link to a Rareware page titled Rumor Mill. So it was basically a Banjo FAQ page. And if the header at the top was to believe, it was either written by Gregg Mayles himself or just sourced from him, and I guess it would be Lee that physically wrote it. But midway down the page, the question comes up: is there any way of replaying Grumpy's quiz show / the first end sequence / the final battle instead of going straight to the credits? And obviously it's Rareware, so most of the answers they gave for the reader to choose from were jokes, but the serious answer that they gave was it seemed inconsistent to kill someone that was already dead. So, I took full advantage of that boss select in Banjo-Tooie. I think doing that was the right decision, but I just love the idea that his first instinct was to go, what do you mean refight Grumpy? We already stopped her. Again, I don't have a very comprehensive answer to my own question, despite how long this has gone on, but if I had to give one, that's the thing I point to. That's Gregg Mayles to me. So, thank you.
Thank you for the calls, Andre. Thank you for everything in this episode. It's always great to hear from you. Seldom do. And yeah, that's actually something that I hadn't thought about all that much, is the permanence of your actions in Banjo-Kazooie versus Super Mario 64.
Yeah.
And I can see both points of it, but personally speaking, and maybe this is just speaking to who I am, what I look for I'm hesitant to say video games now because Andre's made me self-conscious about it, but I loved seeing that Gruntilda was underneath that boulder in Spiral Mountain.
Yeah, definitely.
And I
think that having that replayable boss fight, it's interesting because like if it was replayable, I don't think anyone would think anything of it. Mm-hmm. Like if you could replay it, but also you could go down and see Grunty underneath the boulder. Yeah. But there is some dedication to making it not be that way. It's fun to think about. I think it's also probably heavily influenced by the fact that it was their first foray into 3D. Mm-hmm. Where in a 2D game, if you like on the map screen pick the level that is the boss fight again, and then you just do the boss fight again, I don't think it feels like you're turning back time so much as just that is what the level is.
Right.
But for some reason you jump into 3D and then it does feel like you're turning back time if you're doing something over again like that.
It does, because it feels more lived in. It feels less like you're pulling up a level, and it feels more like you're walking over here or going over there after being there. You know what I mean? So, but I've always liked that in video games where there is some lasting effect to you beating the game or just any accomplishment. But that little touch in Donkey Kong Country, the original, where you defeat K. Rool, and you can still fight K. Rool all you want, but you go back into the Banana Horde cave in Jungle Hijinks, and all of a sudden it's full of the bananas, and Donkey Kong cheers.
Yeah.
It's just,
yeah,
it's just
we love that he can.
Yeah, it's this affirming thing that, yeah, I did that, and I can see my accomplishment whenever I want within the game world itself. It's not just a matter of telling my friends, yeah, I beat it, or seeing that the completion percentage is at a certain level on the file select screen. It's, no, I can see my accomplishment right here. It's the bananas, or it's Gruntilda being trapped under this boulder. It makes the world feel, even in the end game where there's nothing left to do, it makes the world feel immersive. That's the key word.
Yeah, I do wonder how much of that is just, there's some, like, you would call it a state machine. Have you heard the phrase state machine?
I haven't heard many things, Mitchell.
A state machine is a programming term. Very heavily used within video games that manages the states you can be in a game. So like an example here, we're looking at the final boss in Banjo-Kazooie. You could be in the state of not having beaten her yet. And then after that, it's the state of having beaten her. Sometimes they're hard to manage. Sometimes you need to be like, oh, well, let's not let the player try it again, because otherwise it could mess up our state machine flow. Mm-hmm. Something like that. So I wonder if there is a technical aspect as well. And maybe there's some things here that, like, I'll assume they're all design decisions, but some things might not be design decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, oh man, remember how in the XBLA version of Banjo-Kazooie, you can prohibit your file from being able to be 100%ed? If you play Bottle's bonus thing.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because they changed the way the game works for the notes to not respawn when you collect them, which is normally very convenient. But because you can see into a level that you maybe haven't gone to yet with the Bottle's bonus challenge, the version of, or like little scene in TikTok, not TikTok Clock. What am I saying?
Click Clock Wood.
Yeah, Click Clock Wood. I think it's Banjo walking around the inside of the beehive, and it has 4 notes in there, and Banjo collects them in that little thing. And because the game has changed, so it just collects them permanently, you now don't get to have those notes. So you're like always going to be 4 notes short. There's just a lot of like little things like that. In that case, it turned out to be a bad thing. And I think in the original cases we're talking about, it turned out to be a good thing. Mm-hmm. but yeah, players both want to replay the bosses like in Banjo-Tooie and also see that their actions have meant something. It can be a fine line to walk through, and I like the way that the Banjo games both sort of go about that.
For sure. Well, thank you for the calls, Andre. We have one more call to take, and then we'll...
Wait, real quick, I also agree that I wish they weren't called video games.
Yeah, I actually found myself nodding when Andre said that, which I'd never thought about it before, but you're right. And that's going to be part of my final thoughts here in just a bit. Once we take this last call, I think I'm going to try to wrap everything up as succinctly as I possibly can, which is kind of hard to do, especially for a career like Gregg Mayles, which is still ongoing, because Gregg could do something completely different with Everwild or the project after that will just completely shatter everything we've talked about on this episode. Who's to say? We might have to do a follow-up one day.
Hey, this is Jennifer. Sorry I mixed up the Mayles brothers on my first call. I guess Donkey Kong 64 really fried my brain. But yeah, Gregg Mayles is great. He's a really great game designer. He makes me like collectathons when it's a genre that I actually don't tend to enjoy when it's made by other studios, and it's really this kind of ineffable magic in how he crafts a game, and with the characters he creates and everything that I'm sure you are going to / have talked about on the show. And it's just, I hope someday he makes another platformer, because I don't think he was involved in ukulele. So I hope he returns to that genre, and he doesn't just feel the need to make the genres that are popular. I'm sure he could make a decent, battle royale shooter or whatever, but please, just make the kinds of games that you used to make, Greg, because the industry sorely needs them. Goodbye.
Thank you for the call, Jennifer. I think that it's less that Gregg is just following trends, and it's more what can he provide. Like I
would be surprised if Everwild lines up with any trends.
I agree.
Even one of them.
Because
any of them at all.
I know with Sea of Thieves, it was definitely like not so much we have to chase this and this and this. A lot of it, like the initial ideas came from Gregg and the other people like Mike Chapman and the Prestons, and it was more just what's a quintessential rare game we can make that would satisfy as many people, not as many people as possible. Like that sounds like we're just making compromises, but after the very tumultuous period that Rare had as a studio, starting with the buyout and trying to find their voice in a rapidly changing industry, on hardware that wasn't as accommodating in its install base as the games they had been making. I do think they managed to find that alchemy with Sea of Thieves. And I think Gregg wanted to do stuff with it that wasn't necessarily, I want to just make this type of game. It's, I want to express and be able to express these type of feelings. And we're going back to feelings over gameplay again. But I think that's also very important to Gregg. And I imagine Everwild is going to be something completely different, as you said, Mitchell, from what is hot right now. Like, everybody's trying to do the big Fortnite-esque games, or, loot shooters, or whatever. I don't know. I don't pay attention, Mitchell.
Well, if it's the game that it used to be, at least in terms of what we knew about it that was publicly stated, it's an action adventure with no combat.
Uh-huh.
And that is actually, to me, there's been some jokes about Everwild because it's been asleep for so long.
Yeah.
And it's been out of the public eye for so long, and it's had 3 changes of directors. That's significant. At the core of it, an action adventure, like open kind of game that does not have combat is something that I don't think I've really seen in that way before. It's something to actually get pretty excited about. whether or not when it comes out it's going to feel like a Gregg Mayles game, or if it's just like, oh, Gregg Mayles finished this other thing that existed.
Yeah.
It could be that way. I don't think it's unlikely. But yeah, that is something I'm genuinely pretty excited about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I would love to see what a mature Gregg Mayles could do with a genre he's already explored. I think there would be even things he would be surprised about that he could say with another 3D platformer or a 2D platformer even. But I also don't want to just make him go back to that if he genuinely never wanted to. If he thought he had nothing left to say, I want him to be able to continue to stretch his muscles as a creative talent. And the beautiful thing about Gregg Mayles is he has inspired and influenced so many others, from his peers at Rare to the people who are younger, who are coming up at Playtonic now, who want to work on the types of games Gregg Mayles made, to the people at Nintendo who are now directly inspired by Gregg Mayles, who himself was inspired by the games of Miyamoto. The influence of Gregg Mayles now extends far beyond the man himself. And that's what's really exciting to me as a fan of Gregg Mayles. Like Yooka-Laylee, but specifically Yooka-Laylee and Impossible Lair, there's so many what you would call Gregg Maylesian elements in Impossible Lair. Not a Gregg Mayles game. Had no hand in that. Steve Mayles, of course, did art for it, but the fact that you can get these philosophies and things that excite me about Gregg Mayles outside of him himself, because he's, like I said, he's mortal. He can only do so much. So to make his philosophies immortal is probably the best situation we can hope for at this point. Considering he can only do so much, considering the limits of what he can do in a studio structure in 2024. I feel a lot better about being such an unabashed Gregg Mayles fan than I did 14 years ago when I came back to DK Vine and made that sort of my full trajectory in my life. And, I ask myself sometimes, why do I still like video games? Why do I do this? Is it just my childhood nostalgia for these games I really liked? Or is there something that keeps me coming back? And reflecting on this, when I was breaking down this episode, I realized that it's one of the few areas of entertainment I have left from my childhood where the magic behind it has been preserved. And Mitchell, you and I are going to see very differently on this, so don't get me wrong. Like, I fully endorse understanding more about how video games are made. I think there is a lot to be said for breaking down the science behind it. But, I went into screenwriting. That's where my trajectory initially took me. And I immersed myself in that world of understanding how to write a screenplay, of how to reverse engineer pre-existing screenplays. And while I can still enjoy a well-made television show or a feature film, I just watched Oppenheimer last weekend. Pretty good. Build a bomb. But because I've...
Yeah, good bomb in it.
Yeah. Because I've studied screenwriting, it has had the effect of making me see the seams in everything I watch. My brain can't just sit down and enjoy something. Sometimes I can. Sometimes something is so well crafted that I find myself getting lost in it. But it's so seldom that I can do this. Oftentimes I'm trying to outpace what I'm watching. I'm trying to rewrite the script in my head or trying to predict where it's going based on what I know about the structure of storytelling in this medium. And because of that, because I'm always trying to be hands-on crafting it in my brain, it kind of kills that immersion for me. But with video games, or electronic entertainment, if you will. You know, I write about these on a weekly basis. I produce video essays on them. I talk about them for hours on end. But I am not a developer. Unlike you, Mitchell, I am a layperson. I know so little about the science behind the craft. And that helps me. That helps me because video games are the ultimate form of escapism that I have left, other than actually going into a real haunted house. I can immerse myself in a fictional world or a world that is adjacent to our own reality, and I can go on these wild adventures with minimal risk to my own well-being. And oftentimes I feel like video games, as they are commonly understood, they fail to meet me halfway with what I want, because they do get so hung up on the mechanical aspects of being a game. They forget to make me believe in the experience I want to be having. 14 years ago, when I went back to DK Vine, this was coming off of the heels of this historical revisionism that everything Rare did was overrated. Donkey Kong Country games were garbage compared to the pure brilliance of what Nintendo was doing. And I think that's why I still kind of take some issue with when people try to break down video games in very clinical terminology. And when you're making a game, it's different. But when people are just talking about them as fans, and they talk about player engagement, metas, modules, it makes me get a bit sick in my mouth. Because
now, what are modules?
Modules, I was hoping you could tell me, because I genuinely don't think
know. I think he threw a word in there. I don't know.
Jeff and Dre are always talking about modules, and I'm just not in modules. You know what? Look it up, get back to me. But I don't know, because I try to not put myself in this headspace, because nothing kills the immersion more for me than breaking it down in ones and zeros. We might live in a simulation, Mitchell. We might. But ignorance is bliss, as that dude from The Matrix said when he ate that steak.
Yeah, I think I don't agree, but I think I don't agree at all, actually. But
yeah.
I'm glad to hear your perspective on it.
I mean, like, I
it
think,
might be one of my modules.
Yeah. I think but you are a developer, and like that is your path. For me, I like to believe in the fantasy. That's where I approach video games, and I think a lot of the conventional wisdoms that were baked into how you make a video game is what I call video game design 101. And it's just Miyamoto. It's how he did it back in the day, because he set the template for the entire industry. But my argument is maybe you don't have to follow those particular beats, because we look at what Gregg Mayles did, how he made the formula slightly askew. And now you see the influence he has on people. And for the longest time, you go online and you see his games, from Donkey Kong Country to Banjo-Kazooie, being trashed because it didn't follow the formula. It defied it. And now you don't see that really anymore. I mean, occasionally you'll get the contrarian out there who'll be like, yeah, Donkey Kong Country, it's only just good graphics, right? And now the graphics look like shit. But generally we're past that, because the impact Gregg Mayles did have on the industry is now readily apparent everywhere you look. And how Nintendo themselves make games of the year. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying like if you are just starting out, if you're an amateur, if you're making a game, you know, in your basement or bedroom, you might want to stick to the basics. You might want to stick to video game design 101, because you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself when you don't know what you're doing. But like Andre said, like, I bristle at the notion that games have to play a certain way, or they have to play at all. Maybe playing doesn't come into it whatsoever, because tastes can be varied, and what might resonate with some may land very differently with others.
What's your pitch for a new word for video games?
I like electronic experiences.
Ludos. It's too wordy. I don't like that. It's got to be short.
Soul
Book.
windows.
It's got to be like book.
Okay. So,
Soul windows. Oh, I like soul windows. That's fun.
because it cuts through you. It cuts through the mortal self, and it gets to what exists deep within you.
The word that we throw around sometimes to describe something unto games, like how you would use the word cinematic for unto film, would be ludic.
Ludic?
From ludo is I think a Greek root for play, something related to play. So ludic, ludo. Got your Ludo bites. You can you play that new Ludo bite?
Okay.
Yeah, something like that maybe good.
Yeah. So, yeah, I realize art is subjective. That's my point. There are things we can say are universally good and bad for sure. Like the Nazis. They're pretty bad. But when it comes to video games, maybe we just have different taste. Maybe these windows to the soul, these Ludos, can be different, and there is enough audience taste out there to appeal to a wide range of people. But this is why I'm a Gregg Mayles guy. This is my point, Mitchell. I am a Gregg Mayles guy because Gregg's formula is the very first time I ever felt seen, that the window to my soul was made transparent. Gregg's formula is to make you, the player, feel like what you're experiencing is real or reality adjacent. And when you're playing a Gregg Mayles video game, you often forget that you're playing a video game at all. And that's what makes them so special to me. Do you have anything else to add to that? Do you want to put a cap
No,
on
I
it?
thought that was okay. I never know when it's happening.
Well, there wasn't anything funny to end on that, so I like put a joke in there.
I thought it was a deceptively sincere conversation ending. I don't know. I thought that you were turning a new leaf. Maybe your Hyle's a serious guy, and he's got his the things he really cares about to say. I don't know.
I don't care for that module for me, Mitchell. I think we're gonna have to re-examine the meta that I'm on right now.
This has been a File 2 production.
Que rico.